Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It is college football playoff talk time. My name is Brian Driscoll. I'm the publisher at irishbreakdown.com, joined by my man Sean Davis, who from ESPN Chicago, also of the Lucky Lefty podcast. So thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we are going to talk about the latest college football playoff rankings. Notre Dame moved up to number 8 in the latest rankings, which is good. There were some people concerned that Oklahoma State would jump them. That did not happen, nor should it have happened. We'll get into that here in a little bit, Sean. But Notre Dame jumps up to number 8. Actually, above them, the next 7 stayed the same. Right. And basically what happened is with Oklahoma State and Wake Forest, they all just moved up a couple spots. Although actually Wake Forest moved up 2 spots because Texas A&M lost and fell down this past weekend. So Notre Dame moves up to number 8, still within striking distance because there's so much ahead of them of teams that have to play each other. And so we'll dive into that as well, Sean. But let's talk about Notre Dame's resume, how that is impacted by the latest rankings. The positive, Wisconsin moved up, 3 spots to number 15. So when you look at Wisconsin, when you look at what Wisconsin has left, there's a good chance it's not as easy as a path of like Purdue, for example, which we'll get into here in a second. But they've got a road game against Minnesota in the regular season. This upcoming weekend, they've got a game they should win against Nebraska. But as we've talked about, Nebraska's got 7 losses, and they've all come by 9 points or less. Yeah. It's not a given that Wisconsin's going to beat Nebraska. So, again, they should win their next 2, but to me, it's not a given because I still don't think this is a great Wisconsin team. But Wisconsin now at 15 is pretty much in the standpoint of losing once, they're still in the top 25. And so that's obviously important for Notre Dame's resume. And then, of course, Purdue drops out after getting beat 59-31 by Ohio State. I'll be honest with you, I was a little surprised by that. I was a little surprised. How are you going to have a 6-4 Mississippi State team in the top 25 who that ESPN was talking about? The AAC is not good this year. Last I checked, Mississippi State lost to Memphis. I'm just saying. Yeah. You got a 6-4 Mississippi State team in who has a loss to Memphis on their docket, barely beat Louisiana Tech, and yet Purdue, who has a win over number 18 Iowa and a win over Michigan State, who you have ranked number 7, drops out. That was a little strange. But Purdue has a non-conference against Northwestern coming up this weekend. Or excuse me, not a non-conference, a neutral field game against Northwestern coming up this weekend. Then they play at home in the last week against Indiana. 3-7, 2-8 teams. Purdue's got to handle business. They got to finish 8-4 because if Purdue wins out, Sean, they're jumping in the top 25, and now Notre Dame has 2 top 25 wins, which matters when it comes down to potentially jumping from 6 to 5 to 4.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I think the party starts with the head-to-heads that are going to be happening, especially in the Big Ten in the coming weeks, with Michigan State facing Ohio State, and then, of course, the big game, Ohio State and Michigan. But now you really have to watch the teams behind the likes of Oklahoma State and Notre Dame, because that really will tell the story or build the resume for a lot of teams that are from, say, 4 to 10. Mm-hmm. And so everything you talked about is, man, right on point. And really, only thing I can add to that is I really wasn't shocked that Purdue was knocked out. Mm-hmm. The game just didn't look good. It just wasn't a good look. And I think a lot of people probably didn't give Purdue enough credit for what they had done to that point. Mm-hmm. And how difficult it would be to once again emotionally get up to go on the road and face Ohio State, who at this point was coming off of their tough stretch of games where they were physically beaten up and they almost got a chance to exhale going home and facing a Purdue team who wasn't quite as physical as a Nebraska or as a Penn State, but still would be formidable. And once they got behind, you know how it is on the road. Once bad things start to happen and that type of game happens, it's really not indicative of how good a team you really are. Mm-hmm. But it's just one of those days. And Jeff Brom and his team, they just ran into a buzzsaw, in Columbus. And it hurts Notre Dame because they drop out of the top 25. But I still believe Purdue will have a chance to get back into the top 25 with their remaining schedule. And like you said, Wisconsin, I believe they're going to run the table. I
Mm-hmm.
think they're going to end up representing the West in the Big Ten championship, and that's going to bode well, especially if they can pull off the upset in the Big Ten championship.
I'm going to be straight up honest with you, Sean. I'm ticked about Purdue's ranking, and forget how it impacts Notre Dame. I mean, at the end of the day, the Purdue win is not going to be the difference maker between Notre Dame going to the playoff or not. Okay.
Right.
Here's why I'm mad. It's completely contradictory of everything that they say, right? So Purdue is 6-4. Okay.
Yeah.
Mississippi State's 6-4. Let's look at what Mississippi State has done. Okay. They have a win over NC State, who they have ranked, I believe, 19 or 20. Correct. That's a decent win. You know, that's a good win early in the season. They have a win at Texas A&M, who dropped down, right? Those are two good wins, okay? Are those two wins better, in your opinion, than beating Iowa and Michigan State? No, they're not, based on the rankings. And then you look at who Mississippi State lost to. Okay, they beat an Auburn team that's no longer ranked, okay? So they lost to Memphis. Mississippi State lost to Memphis, who's 5-5, okay? They then lost to LSU, who's what, 4-6 now, right? They lost to LSU, who's 4-6. This past week, they lost to Arkansas, who is 6-4, or 7-3, and then they also lost to Bama by 40. Okay, so their loss to Ohio State at Ohio State was significantly more competitive, in my opinion, than the loss that Mississippi State had at home to Alabama. Yeah. Look at who Purdue has beaten, as we talked about. They lost to number 18 Iowa. They beat number 18 Iowa, and they beat number 7 Michigan State. Now, here's the thing about both of those wins, Sean. Both of those wins were double-digit wins. They beat Iowa by 17 at Iowa. They beat Michigan State by 11. Their losses are to Notre Dame. Their losses are to they lost at Notre Dame by 14. They lost to Minnesota by 7. Minnesota's a quality football team with a winning record. Certainly better loss. They're 6-4. Certainly a better loss than the loss to Memphis. Then they lost to go back to Purdue. Then they lost to Wisconsin by 17 at home. Not a great loss, but Wisconsin's number 15. And then this past week they lost to Ohio State. Explain to me. Someone's going to have to explain to me how Purdue is dropping more than 6 spots out of the top 25 when Ohio State or when Mississippi State's jumping in. The only way that you can justify it is what people have said in the chat, that it's essentially being used to pump up Alabama's resume. That's the only thing that I can think of, because when you look at the overall resume, there's no excuse for Mississippi State, for example, to be ranked ahead of Purdue. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that's kind of the thing that that frustrated me a little bit. Couple other things when you look at Notre Dame and their resume. Virginia has a chance to shake things up a little bit. So Virginia obviously has a chance to jump into the ACC playoff. I don't see Virginia ending up ranked. I think the dream scenario for Notre Dame is that Virginia bounces back, beats Pitt this weekend at Pitt, beats Virginia Tech. If they do that, they're in the ACC championship against Wake Forest. If they then beat Wake Forest, then now there's a chance that a 9-4 Virginia team can jump into the top 25. Notre Dame would obviously have a 25-point win over Virginia. I don't know if I see that happening, especially if Brennan Armstrong can't play this weekend. They have no chance if Brennan Armstrong doesn't play, in my opinion. So that's an interesting one. And then also that would knock off a team that's kind of creeping up a little bit on Notre Dame, which would be Wake Forest. So Wake Forest now 9-1, had a really good win, committee-wise over number 20 NC State this weekend in a close game. They play Clemson this upcoming weekend, and then they would have a chance for a team, for Virginia or Pitt in the ACC title game. So we'll see kind of how that shapes up here as we move forward. So let's a couple things. Notre Dame's resume. Cincinnati stayed at number 5. We'll talk more about Cincinnati here in a second. Looking at a team that I think is a threat to Notre Dame, and we'll pull up the super chat from Caleb Collins we had up here. Caleb says, "I'm surprised Oklahoma State didn't jump us." I'm not. I don't know why. I guess I'm a little puzzled as to why people thought Oklahoma State was going to jump Notre Dame. There's nothing about Oklahoma State's resume that significantly jumps out compared to Notre Dame. When you look at their resume, they had a nice win over Baylor at home. That's a nice win over now number 11 Baylor. That doesn't necessarily scream way better than Notre Dame's neutral field victory over Wisconsin, who is now ranked 15th. But you look at the rest of their resume, they beat Southwest Missouri State by 7. They beat Tulsa by 5. They beat Boise State by 1. They beat Kansas State by 11 without Skylar Thompson, a quarterback. They beat Texas by 8. They lost to Iowa State, who's now 6-4, so by 10, so significantly worse loss than Notre Dame. Then they have beaten Kansas, West Virginia, and TCU in the last 3 games. Well, none of those teams are worth a darn. They did beat West Virginia's 4-6. TCU is 4-6. Kansas is what now? Do they have 2 wins now? Because they beat Texas. That was their second win of the year, right? They're 2-8. They're good convincing wins over bad teams certainly helps, and that's why I think they are closing on Notre Dame. But there's nothing about that resume that tells me that they should be ranked ahead of Notre Dame. Now, here's the thing with Oklahoma State, and we have a question about that. Sean will be back with us here shortly. Nolan Sanchez says, what if Oklahoma State wins out and Notre Dame wins out, saying Michigan and Michigan State lose one more game, Bama loses to Georgia, and either Oregon or Cincinnati lose? Hypothetical, but I think this is a realistic situation. I still don't see Oklahoma State leaping Notre Dame. It's more possible, but here's the thing you got to think about. If Oklahoma State wins out, they're going to beat Oklahoma, which drops Oklahoma into the 20s, assuming Oklahoma doesn't lose to anybody else. Then they play Baylor, right? And when you look at Baylor, what Baylor has coming up, Baylor is 8-2. They play at Kansas State this weekend. That is not a gimme win for them. If they went out and beat Kansas State and Texas Tech, Baylor will stay, 11-10, and then that'll be a great win for Oklahoma State. Then the interesting thing is what happens with the next that would be the Big 12 championship. But what if Baylor gets knocked off again and then they have to play Oklahoma again in a rematch and they beat Oklahoma? That knocks Oklahoma basically almost out of the top 25. 3 losses late in the season, I think. So I just don't think at the end of the day that their resume is going to be strong enough to leap Notre Dame's overall strength of record and resume. Because again, when you look at Oklahoma State's resume, Southwest Missouri State, a bad Tulsa team, a Boise State team that is now 6-4, a good Kansas State team, but one that didn't have their quarterback. So it's similar to Notre Dame's 6-4 win over Virginia, although it was less convincing. They beat Kansas State at home by 11 and Kansas State didn't have their quarterback, Skylar Thompson. Notre Dame beat Virginia. Again, those two teams have identical records by 25. So then you look at the rest of their schedule. They beat Baylor, great win, similar to Notre Dame's over Wisconsin, although their win was at home. Notre Dame's was a neutral field game. Then they have an 8-point win over a Texas team that is now 4-6 and simply just not very good. They have a loss to an Iowa State team by 3 points. I said by 10, by 3 points on the road. Again, Iowa State 6-4 and unranked. And then the next 3 opponents are 2-8, 4-6, 4-6. So as I'm looking at their record, best I can tell, they've beaten 3 teams with a winning record and only 1 team with a better than a 6-4 record. So their resume isn't better than Notre Dame's. It's comparable in some areas because Notre Dame doesn't have a lot of wins over teams better than 6-4 either. I believe just 1 at this point in time as well. But again, for them to pass Notre Dame, they would have to kind of win some of those games, and they have a lot of close games. So a lot of things you could say about Notre Dame are similar to what you could say about Oklahoma State. So I don't feel that Oklahoma State has a case, and I don't feel like that's why coming into this I didn't see Notre Dame as being a team that was going to get passed up. So that one wasn't. I would not have expected. I would have been surprised if in fact they would have passed up. You ready to roll, Sean?
I'm ready to rock and roll.
Right, good stuff.
My lighting was acting crazy.
Sorry, it looked like your wife was like in the background, like turning a switch on and off. So, Sean, we were talking a little bit about one of the questions people had. So I went off a little bit about Purdue resume compared to Mississippi State's. If you want to talk about that, feel free. But then also what we were talking about is there were people that thought Oklahoma State was going to jump Notre Dame, and I just made the case that other than the win over Baylor, there's nothing else about their resume that stands out. So I think they can eventually leap Notre Dame, potentially, if Notre Dame doesn't blow out their next 2 opponents. But I did not expect that to happen tonight.
It's amazing because one of the processes that we talked about, I believe the last time I was with you, was how the committee is implementing game control and how they're watching how teams control games, which will actually go back to the debate for Mississippi State
Mm-hmm.
because Auburn dominated, but then
Mm-hmm.
the run that Mississippi State went on
They're
to
down
come back,
28-3.
yeah, that might have been skewed heavily in them making it and Purdue being bumped out. But
Mm-hmm.
with that being said, I think with the Big Ten and the SEC being 1 and 2 as far as conference ranks, I would think right then, based upon what we've seen previously, with Oklahoma being at 8
Undefeated. Right.
that lets you know what the committee really thinks about the Big 12. And with the affiliation that Notre Dame does have with the ACC, I think that the ACC,
and that they've played 2 Big Ten teams.
Absolutely. I think that puts them ahead of Oklahoma State. And of course, if Oklahoma State were to run the table, defeat Oklahoma and Bedlam, and go on to win that conference championship, of course, they would be in the conversation to be in front of Notre Dame. But Notre Dame, based upon their resume and the way they've played post Cincinnati, would have a really good argument to say that we're better than Oklahoma State just from an eye test standpoint because of the wins that they do have. And you look at Oklahoma State's games, I believe their loss wasn't Oklahoma State's loss to Iowa State?
Iowa State, yeah, by 3. Mm-hmm.
And Iowa State
unranked in 6 and 4.
Yeah,
right.
They continue to unravel, which I'm totally shocked with what Matt Campbell had coming back, that their season is going the direction that it is going. But with all of that being said, that is like the art and what's being put on the canvas every time they release these rankings is they're not only ranking the teams, but they're really giving you a ranking of the conferences. They're telling you what conferences they respect the most, and they're giving that view. So I really wouldn't be worried if I was a Notre Dame fan at the end of the day if Oklahoma State ran the table.
Unless Notre Dame looks sloppy in the next 2 weeks.
See,
that's the exception.
Now that goes into, how you feel about. I would be very interested because there really was no way because everybody won in front of Notre Dame except for Oklahoma. So there really was no argument for Notre Dame to get bumped up more than one spot.
Not the way that they beat Virginia. They would have had to destroy Virginia to make that case.
At which the opportunity was there.
Yeah.
But there were, circumstances outside of their control.
Right.
That probably kept them from being able to give that type of effort.
Right.
So with all of that being said, it's very interesting because I don't know the path to the top 4 is there for Notre Dame.
It definitely is. And
it's definitely there.
We'll get into that. Yeah. We'll definitely get into that here in a second, Sean, for sure. Wake Forest, we talked a little bit about. That game at Clemson this weekend is going to be very interesting. Very interesting because that's one of those games where, yes, Clemson's not that good.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you. I don't disagree with it. I don't think that they're wrong, but I was a little surprised Clemson now at 7-3 hasn't jumped back in. I think the committee's making the right decision not to put them in. I just was surprised by it. So I was actually happy about that, especially if they wanted to pump up Wake Forest. If they were looking into pumping up Wake Forest, they'd have jumped Clemson in over 6-4 Mississippi State, in my opinion. But I'm glad that they did it. Now, let's talk about couple of the teams. Well, we'll talk about the teams ahead of Notre Dame in a second. I wanted to get into a couple topics that are frustrating me when I watch the ESPN coverage. And the only reason I watch it is because I have no choice. They're the only ones that cover it. But it really does strike me how little depth there is to the analysis in the head-to-head stuff that they were talking about is a perfect example. They said like Kirk Herbstreit does this thing where he starts talking about, oh, head-to-head doesn't matter. And then in the next breath, he says it does. But then whenever he talks about Ohio State, he never talks about Ohio State's resume. He just says Ohio State. But then he talks about Oregon and he talks about, how they struggled for 3 weeks. But he completely ignores the fact that was the stretch when Joe Moorhead was not really with the team as much, or in say case of Stanford, not at all. He never actually says who Ohio State has defeated. What's Ohio State's best win right now? It's the same team that was Notre Dame's second best win.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
At home.
At home.
Like they never ever talk about that. They always say, well, Oregon beat Ohio State, and you have the only justification for having Oregon ahead of Ohio State is the head-to-head. No, it's the fact that Oregon has a win over the number 4 team, right?
Yeah.
On the road, and Ohio State's best win is at home over Purdue. They never talk about that. It's like, if you want to talk about the absurdity of head-to-head, then let's have a conversation about Michigan and Michigan State. That's one that I think is a legitimate beef, because I think their resumes are overall pretty similar, except the fact that Michigan State beat Michigan, right?
Yeah.
This thing about Ohio State, look, is Ohio State one of the four most talented teams? Sure. Are they playing at a pretty high level right now? Sure. But at some point in time, don't you have to actually beat somebody to have the committee talk about you should be ahead of a team that has a win over the number 4 team in the country? Yeah. Like, it's just the lack of depth in that analysis is just, it's even for them, it's staggering. And I know you have to be careful with how you talk about it, but for me, it's staggering.
We can be upfront about it because the inequity, going back to how they rank these conferences, the problem that I have is comparatively, and then this plays out. Most people say bowl games don't matter, but this usually plays out in bowl games because you get a top-heavy conference, and I'll say it again. The SEC has always been top heavy because they have 2 to 3 dominant programs. And then everybody else in that conference is just like every other good team in America or every other good program in America. They can get beat on any given Saturday.
Right. A&M has a 10-7 win over Colorado, who's one of the worst teams in the Pac-12.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
You look at Mississippi State, barely beat Louisiana Tech and lost to Memphis.
Yeah.
I'm going to say that again. They beat Louisiana Tech by a point, and they lost to Memphis. Auburn lost at Purdue, and they kept being ranked higher than Penn State. They kept being ranked higher. Like, to me, there's no justification for having this, giving the SEC to the benefit of the doubt, which is the point that you're making, Sean. And I just wanted to throw some context into the point you're making.
I think it's totally unfair to say that a team that might have a loss to a middle of the pack team, say in the ACC, should get punished more for Alabama losing to a middle of the pack team in the SEC.
Yeah,
such as Texas.
Because all they do is put that middle of the pack team and bump them in the top 20.
And it's like, oh, that middle of the pack team in the SEC is better. Why? Because the difference in the margin between the two teams is the same, regardless of the conference. You're basically saying that a top tier team in this conference lost to a middle of the pack team in their conference. That should have equal value. It shouldn't be looked at differently because it's the SEC or the Big Ten, or you rank that conference higher. I think that's an inequity. It's totally unfair. And it gives teams bonus points for losing games that they shouldn't lose. Like Alabama should be punished for losing a game against Texas A&M.
A 7-3 team.
Yes, that they should not have lost as an elite team.
Right.
And for me, that's an inequity. And it has to play out, and it will play out. It's already played out in our eyes, right before us, because Alabama's ranked number 2. Like, we lost to a 7-3 team.
Yeah, who controlled the whole game, basically. I mean, they were winning they weren't dominating Bama, but they were winning almost the whole game.
And you know what? I'll ask you this. Okay, of course, if I ask you, what is Texas A&M's best win? You're going to say, okay, number 2, Alabama, right? I can sit up here and say, you know what? Clemson's 7-3. And you know what? They played Georgia closer than anybody in the SEC.
Right.
Everybody in the SEC has gotten blown out, and Clemson played them closer from the ACC, and they're 7-3. So what are we really saying? Like, if Clemson and Texas A&M played on a neutral field, I feel like Clemson's defense can hold Texas A&M's offense.
Here's Georgia's margin of victory in SEC games. 27, 62, 37, 24, 17, 24, 37, and 24. Their margin of victory over Clemson was 7. They didn't score a single offense. Oh, they had guys injured, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, Notre Dame played without 3 defensive starters this week. I mean, we could play that game all day. And again, I get the point you're making, Sean, and I'm with you. It's just there's this assumption that this league is better, and they completely ignore the fact that the SEC has some bad wins, like a 3-point win for Texas A&M over Colorado.
Yes.
Right? The fact that Mississippi State lost to Memphis and 4-6 LSU. LSU went and lost. I mean, let's be honest. The SEC didn't exactly have a great non-conference against the Pac-12.
No. LSU
And they went what? They went
1-1,
1-1, right?
Yeah.
They went 1-1. LSU got smacked by UCLA, and Texas
Yeah.
A&M barely beat Colorado. Colorado's getting their butt kicked every week in the Pac-12.
Right.
Right. So that didn't. And then there was another thing they said, Sean. Joey Galloway, guy kills me. He says they were talking about the rankings of Michigan State ahead of Michigan ahead of Michigan State. He goes, well, they don't really matter. I was like, because those teams are all going to have to play each other. I'm like, yeah, they do matter, right? They matter because you're setting a precedent for how to rank teams.
Exactly.
And that matters. It may not matter specifically in this case because the teams play head to head so much, but it does matter because you're setting and this is the thing I've always said, Sean. People have said, well, you know, like I've said, Notre Dame gets biased, but committee's biased against Notre Dame, and you and I have always pushed back against that. And the rationale is, well, look at the precedent. The precedent is that they're not. And, well, they're not going to have a friend of mine, good friend of mine. We had a really good talk about whether Alabama will or won't get in. And I said, I don't know about Bama getting in, but I'm pretty sure a 2-loss Alabama team's not going to get in over a 1-loss Notre Dame team. And he said, well, if they win the SEC championship, his premise being they lose to Auburn and then beat or Arkansas and then beat Georgia.
Right.
And I said, well, there's precedent though, right? We have to look at precedent. What's the precedent for that? Penn State and Ohio State in 2016. Penn State went 11-2, won the Big Ten championship, beat Ohio State head-to-head, and didn't get in because they were too low. Ohio State goes 11-1, doesn't even play in the Big Ten championship. They get in. So I can only go by the precedent. And what they're doing now is they're setting a really bad precedent that they're going to look at really like these analytic like things that don't really make a lot of sense, like game control and some of these other factors that just to me just like that shouldn't be as I'm fine looking at it, but it shouldn't be as in a prime status that it seems to be to them. Look, their resumes are almost identical. Their opponent records are extremely similar. They've played, neither of them have played Ohio State yet, so you don't have that opponent in common.
Right.
Michigan State lost to Purdue. Michigan didn't play Purdue, right? And Michigan beat Wisconsin. Michigan State didn't get a chance to play Wisconsin. We don't know how those games would have played out if the other teams would have played each other. But what I do know is that they played each other 2 weeks ago, and Michigan State beat them. And the fact that, they almost give Michigan being up 30-14 as like this badge of honor. Hey, they were up 30-14. And I'm like, and they blew the game. Like, at what point in time does that stop being a something they're given credit for and turn into, you shouldn't be ahead of them when you blow a 16-point second half lead, and that's why it matters, because they're setting some really bad precedents. We got a real quick super chat from Benjamin Weiss. Thank you, Benjamin Irish Breakdown. We appreciate you being in here. So that's kind of my rant, Sean, about just some of the absurdity that we heard about from the talking heads at ESPN tonight.
And that's why analytics, sabermetrics, whatever you want to get into, can be factual, but not necessarily be the truth.
It's a good tool.
It's a tool,
but it has to be used correctly.
You look at plus minus in the NBA. Like, I could be a great defender and have a terrible defender on the court, and my plus minus is affected because they're not doing their job. And what you're talking about with Michigan State is the absolute same thing, right? Because you're looking at game control in that Michigan State game, but you won't dig deeper and say, okay, Michigan State banged Rutgers, and Michigan struggled with the same team at home.
Right.
So comparatively, maybe they both didn't play Purdue, but
and they both barely beat Nebraska.
They both barely beat Nebraska
by 3 each.
One team struggled at home against Rutgers, and the other one went on the road and won convincingly against that same team. So, and that's something that's just eye test and head to head.
And there's more, Sean. There's others like Michigan beat. So if they want to talk about game control, you say, well, Michigan beat Northwestern 33-7, whereas Michigan State beat Northwestern 38-21. But if you watch that Northwestern game, it was 10-7 at halftime for Michigan and Northwestern, whereas Michigan State controlled the game for 60 minutes.
Yep.
And so those are the things you kind of get into and say, okay, well, what did Michigan do? They beat a Washington team at home by 21, who currently is under 500 and just fired their coach. Michigan State went on the road against an ACC team and won by 21, and it's a team with a 500 record. And then you look at some of their other wins, like you said, one team blew Rutgers out, the other team didn't. Michigan has a better win over Indiana than Michigan State does. Like, we could play this game all day. That's my whole point. They have very similar, comparable resumes. It's not like Ohio State and Oregon, where one team has a win over the number 5 team and the other team hasn't beaten a soul that's in the top 25, right? This is different. It's resumes are similar. Michigan State has the better individual win by far. If you're just looking at resume, it's not even about the head-to-head. It's about what is the best win for Michigan State. It's the number 16.
Yeah.
6 team. What is the best win for Michigan? It's the number 15 team.
Totally agree.
Okay, that's a big difference.
That's a big difference.
That's a big difference.
And if I'm Mel Tucker, because I believe they're friends, I probably would have placed a call on Sunday morning to the head coach, because I don't want to mention his name, to the head coach of the Nittany Lions, and asked him straight up, like, why did you just give that game away?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like,
you are off the Christmas list.
Yeah, this would be a talking point. You gave the game away. That's another thing. Like, if you watched that Penn State-Michigan game and you came away, like, impressed with Michigan, because I felt like I was watching a Michigan team that was very, very similar to other Michigan teams under Jim Harbaugh. Right? Who go in, you might say they have better talent, but they find a way to make mistakes and give a team a chance to win the game. And Penn State just didn't want it.
Mm-hmm.
Or the coaching staff just didn't want it. So I'm not impressed with Michigan. I think personally that Michigan State is a better team.
Mm-hmm.
They showed that head-to-head. I think their resume is better. You just pointed that out. And I don't understand by what metric or analytic the committee can see otherwise. I just don't.
Yeah, I agree. So, Sean, let's talk about Notre Dame's pathway. And we had this on a conversation the other day, because here's where I'll push back a little bit on you. So, first of all, the whole thing about Michigan State, when they're saying it doesn't matter, what they're saying is, well, both of those teams get a shot at Ohio State coming up.
Yeah.
And then Michigan State still has to play Penn State. But as we've seen, Penn State likes to choke away big games against Big Ten teams. They've done it now 3 times, right? I mean, where they've given kind of games away in their conference. So you've got Michigan State and Ohio State play this weekend. One of those teams is falling below Notre Dame. So that immediately jumps them up to number 7. If it's Ohio State that beats Michigan State, and I think you and I both believe it's going to be, because it's at Ohio State, and Michigan State's defense couldn't stop Purdue. Purdue's got a nice team, but they're not Ohio State.
No.
So let's just say Ohio State wins. That's one team. Well, then a week later, Penn State or Ohio State then plays Michigan. One of those teams is going to fall below Notre Dame. So that moves Notre Dame up to number 6. So if Notre Dame wins out the next 2 weeks and does what they're supposed to do, meaning win convincingly over 2 garbage teams that are 3 and 7, then they're at worst 6. There's some other games. So then you look at Oregon, who's sitting there at number 3.
Right.
They play at Utah this weekend. Okay. Barring Utah getting upset in following weeks by I'm trying to remember who Utah plays. Let me just pull it up here real quick, Sean. Utah plays Oregon this weekend at home. Then after that, they play Colorado. So reference over Arizona State. The reason Utah at 7-3 is in control of their own destiny is because 2 of their losses were non-conference. They lost to BYU and San Diego State.
Right.
They've only got 1 in-conference loss. That was to Oregon State. They beat Arizona State head-to-head by 2 touchdowns. So if they lose to Oregon, Arizona State has 2 in-conference losses. So Utah losing to Oregon this weekend, if that happens, would put if Oregon beats Utah this weekend, that would put Utah at 7-4, but they'd only have 2 conference losses, same as Arizona State, because Arizona State's got 3 losses, but one of them was to BYU. They both lost to BYU.
Right.
So they'd have the same conference record. Utah would have the head-to-head. So as long as Utah then goes out the next week and beats Colorado at home, they're in the Pac-12 in a rematch. They're the Pac-12 South champs in a rematch against Oregon. It is hard to beat good teams twice. So Oregon's going to have to beat Utah twice. They're also going to have to beat Oregon State, which they should. It's at home. But Oregon State's kind of jumped up a couple times and bit some people this year.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, Oregon is not a gimme to win out at all. And a 2-loss Oregon team won't be in, shouldn't be in, or shouldn't be ahead of Notre Dame. It's not about whether or not they're going to be in. It's like an 2-loss Alabama team could make the playoff. They're just not going to make it over Notre Dame,
right?
In my opinion, assuming Notre Dame wins out. So Oregon's in a danger zone. Cincinnati has not been playing well. They're going to have to play better because their schedule finally steps up a bit. They play 8-2 SMU this weekend. Then they play 6-4 ECU. ECU's not a bad football team. Now, should they beat Cincinnati? No. But they're not a bad football team. Like I said, they're 6-4. I believe their head coach is the guy that led James Madison to a title. Isn't he their head coach now?
Yeah, he
guy
is.
that led James Madison to a national title a couple years ago. They just beat Memphis on the road. They have blowout wins over Temple. They lost by a touchdown to Houston, lost by 4 to UCF on the road, and then they lost at home to South Carolina in game 2 and lost to App State in the opener. So they have won 3 straight games. They're not a bad team. They've blew out Tulane early in the year too. So that's a competitive game. And then assuming Houston handles their business, which I believe Houston has to win one more game to clinch, they have to play Houston, who now checks in at number 24. And then Houston should win their next 2 games. They play Memphis at home. Memphis is okay. They're 5-5 team, Memphis AAC team that beat Mississippi State, by the way.
Right.
So basically, Memphis has more top 25 wins than Ohio State. I'm just throwing that out there, right? Just throwing that out there.
Yeah.
And then they play at UConn, and that's going to be a W. So you got a chance for Cincinnati to get a good win, but there's also a chance Cincinnati catches an L. And so,
and you're basing that not just on the schedule, but look, Cincinnati just seems like one of those teams that they're just holding on.
Yeah,
right? They got their big win against Notre Dame, and now it's almost like they're really not playing. They're just kind of like holding on, hoping they can get to the conference championship game. And when you play like that, more than likely, the team unexpectedly jumps up and bites you. And they've had that happen. They've had the close calls with the lesser teams in their conference. When you start to face the teams that can really put points on the board, you haven't been efficient. All it takes is like one major injury. Maybe they lose a Kobe Bryant in the defensive backfield, or maybe Ritter twists his ankle in a game or something like that. Strange things happen, but they have put themselves in that position.
Right.
Based upon the way they've played. So the path for Notre Dame, like you said, is definitely there.
Yeah.
There's some tough games for all of the teams in front of them.
And then Alabama plays Georgia.
Absolutely.
Now, worst case scenario for Notre Dame is Georgia wins out and Alabama beats them in the title game. And now, because if they're both 12-1, they're both in. I mean, and honestly, they should. I mean, they're 4 of the best teams right now, in my opinion. And somebody asked us earlier for our top 10. We'll give that here in a second. But so, Sean, when I look at this, I see that pathway. I see automatically up to 6. Now, all of a sudden, you need 2 of 3 things to happen.
Yeah.
You need between Oregon, Cincinnati, and Alabama, you need 2 of those 3 teams to lose. Whoever it's to. So I don't think that's super far-fetched. It's going to be tough, but it's going to be super far-fetched.
Right.
And then Patrick Fitzgerald pulled this up and he said, this is Bart is the commissioner of the head of the committee. He says there hasn't been any discussion. This is what he said on ESPN. There hasn't been any discussion about ranking Notre Dame ahead of Cincinnati, akin to ranking Michigan ahead of Michigan State, despite the head-to-head win. There shouldn't be, because right now Cincinnati's undefeated and Notre Dame's got 1 loss. If Cincinnati goes 13-0 and Notre Dame goes 11-1, Cincinnati deserves to be ahead of Notre Dame. Absolutely. That's not the argument. The argument is if Cincinnati loses a game. And then they're on a little bit more on equal footing, because you could say Cincinnati's 12-1 at the end of the year, but one of their wins was over Murray State. And I don't look at FCS wins, and neither should the committee. They should not count FCS wins as part of the equation, unless you're playing like North Dakota State, right? That's about it.
Right.
So right now there shouldn't be a discussion of Cincinnati over Notre Dame, because Cincinnati beat Notre Dame by 11 in a game they led the entire game, and they don't have a loss yet.
No.
The discussion we're having is, will Cincinnati stay there if they lose? that's the conversation. And, you talk about since they've been holding on, they've really been doing that all year. They have not, the only game they looked good, and I say good because I still say that Notre Dame, that game was more about how poorly Notre Dame played than it was how well Cincinnati played.
I agree.
Was the Notre Dame game. And that was a big win for them because they came into that game fired up. They played hard. They battled. They didn't play overly well, but they haven't played overly well all year, but they keep winning. And if they keep winning, they deserve to be in. And if Cincinnati keeps winning, they will get in. What's going to cause a revolt amongst fans, this has got to be this committee's worst case scenario. Cincinnati wins out. Ohio State wins out. Oregon wins out. Georgia wins out. Now they got to decide between a 13-0 of Cincinnati and an 11-2 SEC runner-up Alabama. You know who the committee is going to want to put in, and it's not the Bearcats.
Right.
It's going to be Notre Dame. So they're sitting there crossing their fingers Alabama. They're going to want to put Alabama. They're going to have to put in. They're crossing their fingers saying, let's go SMU. Let's go ECU. Yeah. Let's go Houston. They don't want to be there.
They will be trying to avoid 2 rematches in that sense, because you can't – a 2-loss Alabama team can't be higher than a 4th seed. They can't.
And you're going to have a hard time convincing me a 2-loss SEC champ or SEC runner-up should be in over a group of 5 undefeated team.
Right. And Cincinnati more than likely will be the 4th seed.
Yeah.
If they get in.
Because to your point, that what you're explain what you mean, Sean. Because if they put Alabama in over Cincinnati, the both games would be immediate rematches. So explain what you're talking about.
What I'm talking about is we saw Georgia and Cincinnati play last year. Was that the Peach Bowl they played in?
Mm-hmm.
They played in the Peach Bowl. Mm-hmm. And then if we get the match, where we're going to get the match, I believe, Georgia versus Alabama in the SEC championship game. If Georgia wins out, they beat Alabama in the SEC championship game. Do you mean to tell me, and once again, we have to watch that game over again?
Right, in the playoff.
Because you choose to put Alabama in above Cincinnati, and we have to watch Georgia, which would be totally unfair to Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you have to beat this team.
It's like what happened to LSU in 2011.
Yeah.
It was totally unfair that LSU had to beat Alabama in a rematch when they'd already beaten Alabama at Alabama.
Yeah. So it's totally unfair. So I hope the committee would have enough common sense.
That's the other rematch is Ohio State, Oregon. That was the thing you're saying.
But that's based upon you saying that they both went out, right?
Right. I don't think the committee. You got to do you want to have a bad? Because look, not a lot of people are going to care about the Georgia-Cincinnati game. Outside of Cincinnati and Georgia fans, not a lot of people are going to be paying attention to that one.
Right.
They're going to be saying, okay, who's going to win the Oregon-Ohio State game, and then they're going to play Georgia, right? If you Alabama, Georgia obviously be a matchup a lot of people would want to see in the SEC, but a lot of people in the country are like, I don't want to watch round 2 of this. It is the worst case scenario for the committee for that to happen. For those things, they've got to hope that either Oregon or Ohio State gets beat. But then again, if Ohio State gets beat, I'll tell you what is a really unsexy playoff of Georgia, Oregon, Cincinnati, and Alabama.
Yeah, the biggest.
This is basically like, well, we're just going to get a rematch of the SEC championship game.
Yeah. So now what the committee wants, let's just play devil's advocate and kind of, connect my car to your train.
Mm-hmm.
The committee wants Georgia 1, Oregon, Ohio State at 2 or 3, and Notre Dame at 4. That's what they want. If we're talking about business, television, marketing, those are the 4 teams they want. And this is just based upon what you said with Georgia, Ohio State, and Oregon winning out. What they would prefer is for Cincinnati, like you just said, to lose one of those last 2 games. Everybody in front of Notre Dame to lose also. Get clipped out. That's Michigan State and Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Notre Dame gets up there, and then you take Notre Dame over that 2-loss Alabama team.
Right.
Get them in. And you talk about marquee matchups, Georgia versus Notre Dame in this semifinal.
Mm-hmm.
Ohio State versus Oregon in the other semifinal. I think it breaks viewing records for the semifinals. I really do. I really do. And that match, well, that's kind of jumping ahead, but I think it would be 2 really good matchups. You know why? Because I don't think just go Alabama to me is not a good matchup for Georgia because I just don't think this is your father's or Nick Saban's typical physical Alabama team in the trenches.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the most dominant teams I've seen in the SEC. They remind me from a dominant standpoint of what LSU was in a different way with Joe Burrow, which that was pretty much about that offense.
Right, it's the opposite, right?
It was opposite. This team is really dominant. I call them like the boa constrictor of college football. And what I mean by that is early, you have some wiggle room, but the more you struggle, the tighter their grip gets on you as the game goes. Like they just put the noose around you and they just tighten the screws. And before you know it, you're pulling out fake reverses, double reverses, pass backs in like the second quarter, just trying to get a first down.
Right.
And they just take you out of your game. And I haven't seen anybody dominant like that defensively since probably the 2015. I would probably say the 2015 Alabama defense was very similar to that. I think the defense that he beat Texas with was similar to that as well.
I think that 18 Clemson defense was pretty flipping good.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
You're totally right. That Clemson defense was as dominant. And when you get teams like that are dominant.
Because they had great players on all three levels, and that's
Absolutely.
what Georgia has.
Absolutely.
Not quite as much on the back end as the front two, but their front seven's as good as
it looks.
Yeah.
So, all of that being said, I think the path for Notre Dame is a little bit better than what we felt like when the first rankings came out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
When the first
for
rankings
me.
came out, I think the fan base was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
There's no way.
There didn't seem to be a path.
Yeah.
But in the first week when Michigan State lost and Wake Forest lost,
right,
that was like you needed that first weekend of chaos. And then Oklahoma losing to Baylor this weekend has really opened up the pathway. Honestly, right. I'll say this. I think the pathway is a lot cleaner now than I would have said a week ago. I still thought a week ago was going to be challenging. But now when I look at the teams ahead of them and what's in front of them, it's going to get really interesting. And Sean, we have a super chat question for you.
Cool.
Just your ordinary Joe. Sean, in that Notre Dame needs to blow out next to opponents. Here's a question. Might this call off the Dogs policy be a Jack Swarbrick thing rather than BK?
You would be more versed in the relationship between those two and how things run.
I'd be very, very surprised
if
that were the case.
Since he used that phrase, call off the Dogs, I'll just point to Exhibit A, which was the last game we just watched on Saturday night. If anybody calls off the Dogs, has that mentality, it's Brian Kelly, in my opinion. And I understand that there were a lot of players sick that put Notre Dame behind the 8 ball going into that game. And Virginia was behind the 8 ball going into that game, losing possibly one of the best quarterbacks in the nation.
And their starting running back didn't play.
And the starting running back. With all of that being said, this is one thing. Virginia threw the white flag on this game before the game took place. And if you listen to Bronco Mendenhall in his press conferences leading up to the game, he kept stressing how important the Pitt game was. He talked about Pitt just as much as he talked about Notre Dame.
And we talked about that in our shows last week, Sean, too, is there's other than pride, there was nothing for Virginia to play for against them.
Absolutely nothing.
They have an ACC championship still in their grasp. They didn't need to submit Brennan Armstrong to hits against the Notre Dame. I mean, look how many hits the quarterback that they had took. Yeah. Right? You know, the one time Bo Bauer just slams the kid to the ground. You don't want to go busted up ribs doing that.
No, you don't want that. And we knew, not knew, but I suspected that if Brennan Armstrong tried to play that game at 70%, I felt like Marcus Freeman was going to lose the Dogs.
He wasn't going to make it 60 minutes.
No, there's no way. Not with a rib. And you saw him in pregame, the way he was throwing, he was wincing. They made the right decision. Now, does he force the issue to go ahead and face, Kenny Pickett and Pitt? That's a totally different story. So Brian Kelly is the one that called off the Dogs. And I think he called off the Dogs before
In the second quarter, well, yeah.
No,
Well,
I'll
see, I don't agree with that. I thought they were pretty aggressive the first two. To me, they called off the dogs at that 1:16 mark when you get the ball at your own 15 with 2 minutes left. I just don't see how that's and Joe's not saying like Jack Swarbrick's on the phone saying, "Hey, Brian, run the clock out." It's just more of the overall philosophy of, "Hey, we're not trying to embarrass anybody."
Yeah.
But when I watch the other sports, I don't think there's anything that would make me think that, like, why would he tell that to the football team and not the basketball team? Because the basketball team hasn't taken, they don't do that, nor should they. So yeah, I don't think it's a Swarbrick thing.
The reason I said that, and I didn't feel like that watching the game, but it hit me post game when he's talked on the field after the game, and he said we were never in trouble tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And that stood out. Like, what do you mean you were never in trouble? So, like, in his mind, his team, and granted, he's a head coach. So he's looking at what his team is dealing with and what they were up against. And I think he knew very early on in that game before it got to 21-0 that they were going to be able to control that game.
Mm-hmm.
I think he knew it from the sidelines. And when he made that statement, like, we were never really in trouble tonight. We had control of the game. That's what I mean by that. It wasn't because he sat on the ball, before halftime. It was like early on in that game, he recognized that Virginia really wasn't going to be a problem for his team, even with his team dealing with illness, injuries, captains out. He felt pretty good about being able to win that game. And then once he got up 21-0, I think at that point,
that's when he decided they were going to get out of this.
That's when he activated.
But that's not the mentality. Repeat it. I want to bring this up because it's along the same lines. British Boy says, in response to the super chat, a 28-3 win over Virginia looks way better on paper than a 48-23 win. If you drop 40 on the Cavs, response is everybody drops 50 on them. Completely disagree, because what they would say is, wait a minute, everybody scores 50 on them and you only scored 28?
Yes. Yeah.
So you can say, well, they held them to 3. Look, the reality is holding them to 3 is not going to be as impressive because their quarterback didn't play. Okay, what we're saying is not that it should have been 48-23. Their quarterback didn't play. If Notre Dame would have beat them 48-23 and Brennan Armstrong would have played, that'd have been a phenomenal win for Notre Dame in the eyes of the committee. What it should have been is 48-3. That's the argument. Or 38 or 42 or 45. That's the point. But to say that you're taking a preconceived opinion and trying to spin the facts around it. The reality is what I could say is a counter to that is simply everyone. We've said this on our show. Power 5 teams were averaging, or FBS teams were averaging 34.6 points per game against Virginia. You only scored 28, and you were completely healthy on offense as far as like the sickness and things like that. Right. All you lost is Avery Davis, who's like your 4th leading receiver. You know what I mean? That's just not going to be. Now, you and I may know how important Avery Davis is to this football team, but the committee's not going to know that, right? So no, I don't think that works. I don't think that flies. I don't think that look, the reality is you needed to score 38, 41, something like that. That's what you needed to do.
Ryan, I'm going to step away from the numbers, and I want everybody that's a part of IB Nation and everybody that's a Notre Dame fan to take back your right as a fan to have high expectations.
Yes.
This is Notre Dame.
Yes.
This is Notre Dame.
Yes.
It's okay as a fan to have high expectations for your team.
Right. And it's not a personal attack on Brian Kelly to do so. It doesn't say you don't respect the job he's done to get them to the point where we can actually have this conversation. He's done a phenomenal job getting to this point. But if he wants to take the next step, which is the requirement to be considered a great coach at Notre Dame, that's the next step. And these things, and look, you have to deal with what the modern times are, right? There was a time back in the day where you didn't have to, put it to Virginia. You do now, right? That's the criteria. And if you're going to say you care about championships, then you need to accept the criteria and coach that way.
And if you're going to pull off the dogs, then the coach has to pull the reins, right? To say, hey, that's enough. But there is no way anybody watching us went to halftime and thought we're going to put up 7 points in the second half. No, you didn't think that. You thought at least another 21 points was coming. Because the Cavaliers defense was that bad.
Right.
So it's like that 28-3, what you're talking about is 20. No. The expectations for the second half, they missed the mark.
Mm-hmm.
So that performance was not what we expected.
Right. It was a good win, right?
Good
there's a difference between, and this is the thing, we have to have some context, folks, right? So the people that are upset that we talk about the Virginia game that way, you have to have some context. What are we discussing? Are we discussing whether beating Virginia by 25 on the road is a good win? Yeah, it's a good win. Okay. You beat an unranked team on the road by 25. Absolutely. Good job, guys. Right? I'm saying that seriously. Good job, guys. But the goal is to do it in a way that helps you go compete for a championship. And in my opinion, you didn't do that. And when you set that tone late in the second quarter, that's just not going to happen. So I want to talk a little bit more about, kind of tying this back into the playoff. I want to go back up here to the top, Sean. I'm so excited. StreamYard finally fixed the chat thing so we can actually go to the top. We did have a super chat from Caleb Collins. He asked us for our top 10.
Cool.
I did not tell Sean to rank his top 10. If you want to think about that while you're doing it, Sean, I have mine. Mine would be Georgia 1, Oregon 2, Alabama 3, Ohio State 4, Cincinnati 5, Notre Dame 6, Michigan State 7, Michigan 8. I have Oklahoma State 9 and Wake Forest 10. So I don't have a whole lot different from the committee. I would flip Bama and Oregon simply because I think Oregon is more deserving, in my opinion. Yeah. But I wouldn't lose sleep over having Bama 2 right now. And, I don't like the messaging that they have about Ohio State compared to Oregon, but I also don't have a problem with Ohio State being ahead of Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Because I do think you need to be able to look at what would this team's record be if they had to play that team's schedule. And I don't know if Cincinnati would be any better than 8-2 against Ohio State's schedule so far. So, but Cincinnati to me is right there. If they keep winning out, they'll jump in. They'll jump somebody.
Yeah.
As they should. And then Notre Dame is right behind them to where if Cincinnati loses, I think then they jump. And I think that's what's going to look like here in a couple of weeks. I really think once you get through the regular season, I think we're going to be going into the postseason, the conference championships with Notre Dame at worst being number 5 and being number 6. And when I say at worst, it's like assuming Oregon wins out, which isn't going to be easy. Assuming Bama and Georgia win out, although no, Georgia doesn't have to, because I still think Georgia ranks ahead of Notre Dame even with a loss. But assuming Oregon wins out, assuming Bama wins out, assuming whoever the Big Ten team that wins out, assuming one of them does, whether it's Michigan State or Michigan or Ohio State, whoever is ahead of Notre Dame, and assuming Cincinnati wins out, they're ahead of them.
Yeah.
So that would put Notre Dame at 6. Now, if there's an additional upset, Oregon loses, Bama loses to Arkansas or Auburn, then obviously Notre Dame's 5 knocking on the door waiting on somebody else to lose.
Right. I would go, I'll just name them and then I'll explain. I have Georgia number 1. I have Oregon 2. I have Ohio State 3. I have Alabama 4. Cincinnati at 5. Michigan State at 6. Notre Dame at 7. Michigan at 8. And then 9 and 10 would stay the same for me. The reason why I have Ohio State ahead of Alabama, Alabama's loss to Texas A&M said a lot to me. And as bad as people try to make out the loss to Oregon for Ohio State at home, the same thing we give Notre Dame credit for reestablishing themselves and getting better is the same thing Ohio State has done, especially on the defensive side of the ball, which is really what led to that loss to Oregon. And as bad as we think they played against Oregon at home with a new quarterback and with that defense struggling early in the season, because they struggled the week before against Minnesota. They struggled against Oregon. In the middle of the fourth quarter, they had an opportunity to tie that game. With all of that being said, Stroud had the ball with an opportunity to lead a drive to tie the game. That says a lot to me about that team and the way they progressed. So I would put them above Alabama based upon the fact that I saw Alabama struggle. We've seen what Florida has turned into. And I saw Florida take Alabama to the brink of upset. I saw LSU go into Tuscaloosa and take Alabama to the brink of an upset. So I'm more impressed by what I've seen from Ohio State than I am Alabama. That's why I have them ranked ahead of Alabama and have Alabama at 4. And then Cincinnati right behind them with Notre Dame coming in at 7. And I just like the way Michigan State for me will edge out Notre Dame to this point in the season. Yeah, I think you're muted.
I would not argue that with you, Sean.
Yeah.
Because even though I have Notre Dame ahead, they have a much better win than Notre Dame has.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. I think that's that the one I would push back on is the Alabama. Here's why I have Alabama ahead of Ohio State. Number one is Alabama's losses on the road, and Alabama tied the game up late, and they just couldn't hold on to it. Ohio State was at home. Oregon was without two of the best defensive players, their two best defensive players, including one guy who is arguably the best defensive player in the country when he's healthy, Kayvon Thibodeau.
Yeah.
And the fact that also, you know, again, Ohio State, at some point in time, if your resume is we have a better loss, you don't have a very good resume. And I think Alabama's resume is a little overrated. I don't give them a ton of credit for beating Mississippi State. Where I give them credit is beating Mississippi, because I don't think Mississippi State should be ranked in the top 25. Mm-hmm. Where I give them credit is they did win by 40. The other thing is they did beat – Ole Miss is legit good. They beat Ole Miss, pounded Ole Miss, right? The other thing about Florida is I don't bang them as much for that Florida win because they were in control for a while. Florida came back late. That was also a different Florida team. Florida has lost its way. That Florida team that we see now is not the Florida team we saw early in the year. I kind of liken it to a lesser degree of what we saw from Notre Dame in 2014. Yeah. That Notre Dame team that lost their last 4 games was not the same Notre Dame team mentally, emotionally, or roster-wise as the team that took Florida State to the brink. So I guess I'm just not going to bang them as much for that, but they've got a much better win than Ohio State. Ohio State needs – and now, Sean, this upcoming weekend, if Ohio State does to Michigan State what I think they're going to do to Michigan State, then next week I'm with you. Because they'll now have a better win than what – or at least as good of a win as what Alabama has.
Yeah, and I think what I'm going on, I might have jumped the gun a week.
Yeah.
For flipping that.
Yeah.
You're right. But this is just me just looking at – and I'm really comparing Alabama to what they've been.
Mm-hmm.
Dominant-wise, and saying, you know what, this is not the same Bama team. And maybe that's not fair because I have to judge them by this year, and everything you said is totally correct. The win against Mississippi and the way they dominated them shocked me because I thought that would be –
I thought that was going to be a shootout.
A shootout.
Yeah.
You know, and the way they came in and defensively shut down. This is the only thing I will say. Ohio State's loss took place as they were developing.
Mm-hmm.
They were nowhere near the team they are today that they were in week 2.
My pushback would be is we don't know that yet, though. They haven't played anybody.
I'm speaking defensively.
Yeah, but they haven't played anybody.
Oh, well, I think you'll start to see against Michigan and Michigan State.
Start to see, but we can't evaluate them on what we think they're going to be in a couple of weeks. So I think let's agree to this, Sean. How about this? Let's agree that my argument is stronger for Bama being ahead of Ohio State this week.
Okay.
Your argument is stronger for Michigan State being ahead of Notre Dame this week. So how about that? So does that sound like a fair?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that works. And now again, this weekend we're going to
tell everything.
If Alabama blows out Arkansas and Ohio State kind of beats Michigan State in a close game, I'm still going to have Alabama ahead.
Yeah.
If I think Ohio State's going to smash Michigan State this weekend. And the reason I say that is football is a game of matchups, Sean. You and I both know this.
Mm-hmm.
Michigan State is a horrible pass defense. Michigan shredded them.
Yes.
Purdue annihilated them. They went for over 5 bills.
Yes.
They don't have Ohio State. Yes, David Bell is legit good. He would be playing for Ohio State. But Ohio State has 3 of those dudes. And Stroud's a better quarterback than Aiden McConnell. I mean, it's not even close. And Ohio State has a better run game. They have a better line. They're going to, in my opinion, I could be completely wrong, they're going to destroy Michigan State this weekend. And once that happens, now I'm okay jumping, and just my personal rankings, I'm okay with them jumping Alabama. Now, I'm not having them over Oregon yet unless Oregon loses or struggles with Utah. If Oregon has a convincing win over Utah, that solidifies their ranking. If they struggle with Utah, I don't think Utah's that good. If they struggle to beat Utah, then I'm going to say, okay, if we're looking at this for the entirety of the season, Oregon was better than Ohio State that day.
Right.
But if they struggle with Utah and Ohio State smashes Michigan State, you've got to now start saying, okay, the one knock you had on Ohio State was they haven't beat anybody.
Right.
You can't say that now.
You can't say that now.
So that'll be the interesting conversation part about it.
I'll say this, though. I do expect Michigan State to be a lot tougher than Purdue was. And what I mean by that, it's very rare that you get games like that back-to-back.
Mm-hmm.
Like the ball bounced Ohio State's way early in that game last week a lot.
Yeah. But you had the fumbled kickoff, right? And,
yes.
And Ohio State was just
interceptions and just crazy things happening. Like I said, that everything that Jeff Brom had planned, his game plan is going to shreds. Right. Now he's just trying to play catch up.
And Ohio State was just hot. I mean, that happens sometimes.
And they got Garrett Wilson back. That was huge.
Yeah.
That was huge.
Yeah, he went off. Yeah. It was a bad matchup for Purdue. But again, Purdue moved the ball on Ohio State. And the committee guy talked about that tonight. He said Ohio State is playing offense as well as anybody, but their defense still isn't very good.
Yeah, the defense is, to me, is young. I don't want to say young. See, you taught me this not to say young. The defense is inexperienced.
They are young in the secondary.
In the back end. That's what I'm about to say, in the back end.
Yeah.
And what they've gotten better at is giving up the big – Purdue just methodically move the ball down the field.
Right.
They aren't giving up as many big plays.
Right.
The run support and the tackling has been better.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been able to turn the ball over, which is really all you have to do with the explosive offense they have.
They're almost like Oklahoma, a better defensive version of Oklahoma a couple of years ago. I mean, again, I think their offense is really good. I still want to see it. I just think everything clicked on Saturday against Purdue.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they're that good all the time. We'll find out, though. We'll find out this weekend. If they do to Michigan State what I think they're going to do, it's going to get ugly.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting one. We have a super chat from Craig Sebring. Thank you for that, Craig, by the way. He goes, but if Oklahoma State wins out and wins the Big 12, would they pass us? It depends on two things. Number one, how convincing are Oklahoma State's wins and how convincing are Notre Dame's wins. I'll be honest. If Notre Dame goes out and pounds Georgia Tech and Stanford, and Oklahoma State goes out and pounds Oklahoma and pounds Baylor and pounds who do they play Kansas State this weekend? Let me go look. I forget who Oklahoma State plays this weekend. Just give me 1 second because they've already played Baylor. I know that. They play Texas Tech at Texas Tech. Texas Tech 6-4 right now. If they crush Texas Tech and beat Oklahoma and Baylor convincingly, then I do think at that time Oklahoma State would have a good argument to make about passing Notre Dame. I'm just going to be honest.
Yeah.
No matter how bad Notre Dame beats the two not good teams they play. But that would also require Oklahoma State to do something they haven't done all year, which is look that way. Like the 63-17 over TCU, that was a bit of an anomaly. The only other time they've scored more than 32 points in a game was against Kansas, who's awful. They've won games of 23 points, 28 points, 21 points, 31, 24, 32, 24. I don't see them doing that. And honestly, I don't see Oklahoma State winning out. I don't think they're going to be able to beat Oklahoma and Baylor in back-to-back games. I just don't.
I don't think so either. That would be a Herculean effort on their part. And this team was a different team than you used to seeing at Oklahoma State. Mm-hmm. They're truly dependent upon the running game, not turning the ball over, and defense.
Really good defense.
Yeah.
I mean, they're doing things on defense. I mean, think about this, Sean. They're in the Big 12.
Mm-hmm.
They have yet to give up more than 24 points in a single game. In the Big 12. Now, again, they haven't played Oklahoma yet, but Oklahoma's the way that they played this weekend.
Right.
They're not this isn't a vintage Oklahoma team. So
no.
that's a good question, Craig. I just think it would depend on how they win. Because and the reason we're saying this, that's what the committee's telling us. The committee's telling us it's not just about winning. Because we can complain about it, right? We can complain about whether it should be, but if you're asking us what will happen, we have to apply the criteria that the committee is applying, not what we think they should apply. And Sean, as the committee has made very clear in each of these 3 weeks, how you win is just as important as whether you actually win the game.
Right.
So
I mean, you have to think about that if you're Oklahoma State. Based upon their resume this year, they're not really about to blow Baylor out. They're not about to blow Oklahoma out. And more than likely, the Big 12 championship is going to be a close game as well.
Mm-hmm.
So when you stack that up against Notre Dame, and like you said, if Notre Dame goes out, blows out Georgia Tech, dominates Stanford, which I expect, you know what? That is the expectation. And this goes back to the point we talked about. This is where we should be. We shouldn't be hoping that Notre Dame blows out Georgia Tech and Stanford. That should
no one would be hoping that Ohio State would do that to Rutgers and Maryland
at all.
Right.
That's the expectation, and that's where we are as a program. Like, yes, we've been to the college football playoff 2 out of 3 seasons. So now the expectations and the bar is raised.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's national championship or bust.
Right.
Like, because getting there is not good enough anymore.
Right.
So absolutely.
But I will say this, I would still rather get there and see if you can win than to say, well, just let me get a New Year's 6 matchup that we know we can win. That's part of that accepting being good, but not accepting greatness from Notre Dame. That I think far too, because here's the thing. Look, we can praise Brian Kelly for the great job he's done, but still hold him to the standard that is Notre Dame, right? And just because he's better than the 3 guys before him doesn't mean that he has gotten the bar back to where it should be. That's the greatest thing I can say about Brian Kelly.
Can you say that again?
Brian Kelly has restored the standard at Notre Dame of what the expectation should be.
So
now he's
dug us out of the hole.
Exactly.
So now we're back.
Yes, and it was a deep hole. It was a deep hole. Now, because of what he's done over the last 11 years,
right,
it's now time to say, okay, you can't use Bob Davie and Ty Willingham and Charlie Weiss as a crutch anymore.
No.
Right? I could accept the up and down seasons or not beating top teams in your first 6, 7, 8 years because you were digging out of a deep hole that wasn't your fault. But that's the standard that they have to do now. And so that's when you look at the job Coach Kelly's doing and now saying, hey, man, you got us here. Either take us to the next step or let somebody else do it, right? I think he's capable of taking them to the next step. That's why you want to know why. I was having a discussion, a private message with a friend of mine, somebody I've known for a long time on the message board, Sean. And the thing I said to him was, I said, listen, when you look at why I'm so critical of Brian Kelly, and some people get really bothered by that, and they think it's personal. It's not. Sean, you know where I'm coming from on this. It is the fact that Notre Dame is so close, and the things holding Notre Dame back are things that they're in control over. And now Brian Kelly's got you to the point where you're so close. Mm-hmm. But now it's my job as an analyst of the program. I mean, literally, it's not me alone. This is what should all of our jobs be that cover Notre Dame, to say, hey, great job. Now we're holding you to a different standard because you can no longer use those other coaches' excuse. You've gotten past that. They're in the rear view.
Yeah.
And moving on from Brian Kelly, which we're not advocating for, I'm not advocating for it, doesn't mean you automatically go back to what those 3 coaches did. Because Brian Kelly has changed that standard. Brian Kelly's made Notre Dame a program where you're not hiring the next freaking Ty Willingham or Bob Davie or Charlie Weiss because people want that job. Brian Kelly wants that job, and he is the head coach, and that's what our focus is on. And we're not talking about fire him and hire somebody else. That's not where we're at. It's you've gotten them back to here. Now it's my job to make sure that we're holding you accountable for the standard that is Notre Dame, that you've now gotten them back to the point where we can have that conversation. Because this is still, at the end of the day, Notre Dame. And if Brian Kelly doesn't want to be at a program where the expectation is, if you don't win a title, then we should be talking about, hey, great job, but. And that's what we do. That's what we're supposed to do. And it's not, well, at least he's not. That shouldn't be the standard. We shouldn't be talking about a guy who has not a single win over a team that's going to have less than 3 losses this year is doing the best coaching job he's ever had. He's doing a good job this year. He's got a chance, Sean, to do a great job this year. And it's going to be about blowing out your next 2 opponents and then getting to the playoff and finally doing some damage. And I think he's capable of it. I'm maybe deep down, my goal is to piss him off enough to get mad enough at me to then go prove something.
Right.
right? Because he seems to get, and the reason I say he seems to get more mad at us than he does opponents, right? Like if you ever
Right.
seen Brian Kelly get pissed at a press conference, it's not about the game his team just played or how
No.
bad his team lost. It's at us for the questions we ask, for
Right.
us doing our job.
Right.
Well, I'm not going to back down from that because that's my job. I'm sorry, coach. Your job is to go and win a championship. My job is to be an objective of the program and praise you when it's warranted and then say, hey, it's good, but it's not good enough. So maybe he gets pissed off enough and takes it out on those next two opponents, and then maybe he takes it out on Georgia and who knows what else. But that's the thing for me is I think this team has a chance to do something if they can put it all together, and they haven't put it all together yet. And Vince and I have talked about this, Sean, and that's why in the back of my mind, I want to see this team get in because I think this team has another level that it can and will get to. I really do. I almost feel like this team is bored. Like, I really do. I feel like this team is so much better than the teams they played that it's hard for them to feel challenged.
Which goes against the whole, this team was going to lose 3 or 4 teams and they've been coached so well. Like,
If that was your thought before the season, that was a you problem, not a Notre Dame problem.
Absolutely. Because I definitely didn't look at this schedule and see 3. I remember when I said they would win 11 games and people looked at me crazy. And I'm like, well, show me anything different. But to go to your point, I totally agree. And I would add to that, just hold the man at his word. Yeah. His own words have said, yes, I have the most wins, but I don't have a national championship.
Right.
Those are his words.
Right.
So if that's the expectation that he's put out there in his own words, then guess what? We have to hold him to that.
It's our job. Yeah.
That's our job. We have to hold you to that.
And I want to, when I say they look bored, please take that in the proper hyperbolic context I'm making it. Yeah. It's just that, as Vince and I talked about in the show earlier today, these kids look at the film and they know, Sean, you've been around professional athletes, you've been around college athletes. They know when the other team stinks. They know when the other team's not as good as them. They do. Yeah. And you can only get them so fired up for that game. And that's why I feel like Brian Kelly's business approach hurts them, because he's not doing what you need to do, which is kind of put a little foot up your butt when you know you're playing a team that's not very good.
He's not focusing on the process.
Right. There you go. And so to me, that's why I feel like this team matched up now that this team is hit, because you've got some of these young, like Logan Diggs just plays with a cockiness that I love. And Kyron does, and Lorenzo Styles does, and Austin starting to get there. Mayer does. I mean, this team is starting to play with a little bit of swagger, but I feel like they're not being challenged. And that's why deep down, I want to see this team get a shot at and forget Georgia and screw that. You're Notre Dame. I want to see this team get a shot at those teams, because you know what's going to happen if they make the playoff. You know who's going to be back in the Notre Dame uniform, right?
Yeah.
Number 14. That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right. And now number 14 is going to have a much better safety group around him than what he had before he went out.
Yeah. Can I say this?
Of course.
And I hope people get this. Trust me. Notre Dame, despite the loss, is 10 points better than Cincinnati is.
If they played today, there's no doubt it would be.
They knew that. They knew that when they walked off the field with that L.
And you just automatically got 10 downvotes from the Cincinnati fans who get super in their feelings every time they listen, which I love. I love that. But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
The Notre Dame team today, they know it. They're 10 points better than Cincinnati.
Oh, yeah.
And it's biting at them each and every week that they lost that game.
Oh, yeah.
From the coaching staff down to the assistants, to the Cowboys, interns, whomever is connected to the team, they know they're better than Cincinnati.
And that's what makes me so mad about that game, Sean, because if they do what they should have done that day and just win by a point, we're sitting here with Notre Dame number 2 talking about they're going to beat 2, 3, and 7 teams, and they're locked into the playoffs.
And they're locked into the playoffs.
Right.
Absolutely.
With a guarantee not to have to play Georgia in the first
round. The best opportunity to win in the semifinal
that they've had, right? Because there's no, with all due respect to Georgia, there's no 2018 Clemson or 2020 Bama in this year's playoff.
Nope.
Because those teams, like Clemson, was dominant on both sides of the ball that year. That Clemson team, to me, is as good as this Georgia team, close defensively, the offensive comparison is not even the same universe.
Yeah.
And if you want to say Georgia's better on defense, and we could have that conversation, the gap between the two defenses is much closer than the two offenses. Clemson was way better.
Yeah.
Way better. And so, that's my – hey, we got a couple more super chats here, Sean. Ray Glon, great discussion, fellas. Thank you, Ray. Since we're their biggest fans, we've earned the right to critique BK's lack of killer approach. Go Irish. Yeah, I mean, I think – and the thing is, this is a place where you don't have to agree with us to have that conversation. All we ever ask is that if you're going to disagree, just make a good argument.
Yeah.
We enjoy that. You may say, hey, look, Notre Dame can't win the big one anymore. I know a lot of Notre Dame fans feel that way, sadly. I don't agree with it. I just don't agree with it. But if we get to a day where Notre Dame has done everything they can possibly do and they still can't win, then I will say, but they're not there yet.
Right.
Bry, I think I said this right. I thought it was British boy. I need to get my glasses updated. It's Bryrish boy. So maybe it's Brian and Irish, maybe, perhaps. I apologize for that. I said British boy. Whoops. Bryrish boy with the super chat. Thank you for that. I'm going to see if he has a question down here. Here we go. He says, I believe Diggs, Styles, Watts, Colley, and Colsey contributing in games when it matters the past few weeks on nationally televised games does more to advance recruiting than getting boat race in the college football playoff.
You can do both, right?
Yes. That's right. You can do
Let's
both.
do both.
Yes.
Let's do both.
Yeah. Caleb, exactly. Or how about not get boat race? Why is it assumed that Notre Dame's going to get boat race in the playoff again? Yeah,
Brian, I'm gonna be honest with you, and we've talked about. I don't know if we've gone in depth. That I know I've gone in depth with this with Malik. Look, that unless there's a change, I'm gonna be honest with you. Unless there's a change at one position along the offensive line, that Georgia game is going to be a problem.
They're going to get beat, and they're not going to score much, but they're not going to get boat race. That's my point. Because Georgia,
I think the defense,
it'll look a lot like the Clemson-Alabama game from 2017.
Yeah,
when Bama beat them, what was it, like 24-6 or 20-6 or something like that? Maybe like the Washington game, something like that. It's not going to be 30-3 in my opinion. It won't be like that.
First of all, because, and I'll say this, and this is something I've said to a lot of people. This is the first time I've actually seen SEC teams. Because usually SEC, like you walk into a stadium, it's the SEC. Team might be better, but you compete.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't say teams have been scared of Georgia, but it's almost like
they've allowed Georgia to take them out of their game before the game even starts.
Yes.
Dan Mullen did that with his quarterback decision.
Yeah. It's almost like once Georgia hits them in the face or hits them in the mouth, they take 2 steps back, and then Georgia just bum rushes them and takes over the game. I don't think that's going to happen if they face Notre Dame. Notre Dame went down there to Sanford and went toe-to-toe and had a chance to win. So the next time they see them physically, I think they'll be okay. I'm just worried about that offensive line against that front seven.
Yes. Notre Dame would have to come up with a really filthy game plan to try to avoid that. But the thing is, because of what they've done, the changes they've done with their offense, with RPOs, with being able to get out of the pocket so much better, those are things that I say you now have some tools in your toolbox that allow you to somewhat negate that.
Yeah.
And as we've seen, Kyron Williams not averse to spinning out and making a bunch of people miss. Now the difference is those teams have linebackers that can still flow to the ball and get them.
Yeah.
But I feel like I just feel like this is a Notre Dame team. Like I wouldn't put it past the Notre Dame defense to be able to spot Notre Dame some short fields on offense so I want to see, though. That's my thing. I want to see playing Michigan in a bowl game and beating Michigan, or playing Pitt or Michigan State or Oklahoma State in a bowl game and beating them. I know a lot of Notre Dame fans our age want to get that New Year's 6 big bowl game monkey off their back. I just don't care about that as much as I care about. I want to see how this team competes against the best, because if you really truly want to know where you are as a program, you got to continue to be matched up against the best.
Have to.
So yeah. So we'll see.
So yeah, let's boat race, dominated, crushed, close win, doesn't matter. Get in.
And then now you know where your program's at.
because it helps the brand. It's always positive to get in.
Right.
Right.
And look, the Notre Dame offensive line is either going to step up and play good football, and Jeff and Brian Kelly can know that he's got the right guy leading the offensive line.
Yep.
Or they're going to get embarrassed, and Brian Kelly realizes, okay, our program's not where it needs to be here.
Yeah.
Right. And the receivers can go out and play a great game against Georgia. And he's going to know, okay, you know what? For all the Driscoll criticism that he gives towards Dell, you know what? Dell got it done when it mattered most. And then you can say, hey, Driscoll, go blank yourself. Right. But you'll know. Or the receivers are going to get embarrassed and not play well. And he's going to know, I need to go make some changes to get to that level. You're going to know one way or the other. You don't necessarily learn that by beating Pitt, because Pitt's no different than the teams you've already beat this year.
No.
They don't have the players you have.
No.
They don't have the players you have. And if you can't beat them, then even Michigan's got some really good players at spots. But top to bottom, they don't have Notre Dame's talent. They just don't. So I want to see how they play against those teams. And just beating Michigan or NC State or Pitt or Oklahoma State in the bowl, Michigan State in the bowl game.
Yeah.
I don't care. I mean, it'll be fun to see it, right? But as far as like, okay, are you taking that next step? Like,
and Brian, this is the point, right? Forget there's a process of like banging on the door, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you keep banging on the door until you have that special team. Like when you win a national championship, that's a special team.
Mm-hmm.
That's a special group. And Notre Dame has to keep banging on that door. So we talked about expectations. My expectation, what you just talked about and what you just conveyed about expectations, Brian, every year is national championship or bust. That's my expectation for this program. Of course, we have to make it. Of course we do in order to do that. So when I get there and we're facing Georgia, and Georgia's probably a 10-point favorite, I still expect to beat them.
Right.
I'm like, yo, let's beat them.
You're Notre Dame.
Because we're Notre Dame, and my expectation is a national championship.
Right.
And even though Georgia is a prohibitive favorite, I'm still going to be disappointed and upset when we lose.
Would the gap be any bigger? You and I were talking about this the other day in a private conversation. Would the gap between Notre Dame and Georgia be that much bigger than what it was between Miami and Ohio State in 2002?
From a narrative standpoint?
From a talent standpoint. From a talent standpoint. Would the gap between 2002 Miami and 2002 Ohio State be greater or less than Notre Dame and Georgia this year? I think it was greater then.
If you're looking at what went on to the NFL from those teams, most people would say Miami was a more talented team.
Right.
They would say Miami was a more talented team.
No question. The talent gap was enormous. But Ohio State was a really good, well-coached football team that did not buy the hype. That's the point.
They were a tough matchup.
That's right.
They were a tough matchup because they could punch Miami in the mouth.
Right.
And neutralize all of that speed.
Which is exactly what Notre Dame did to them in 88 and 90.
Yes.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And then there's a couple other things a couple other questions. So Jack Lassen responds to the comment we made about why people assume that. He says, on why people feel like Notre Dame's going to get boat raced if they make the playoff, past performance is the best indicator of future success. Not really, because it's until you get that crack that you realize look, if you want to go on past performance, Clemson should never have been allowed in the playoff because they were a team that lost every big. I mean, it was literally Clemsoning was a thing. Right? That was a thing until they got the opportunity to get on that stage and they did it.
Yep.
Right? I mean, Ohio State, why should Ohio State have got another crack at Clemson last year? Well, they got beat the last two times they played. They got beat 31-0 the first time and then blew a 16-0 lead the second time. Why does Ohio State get another crack at Clemson?
Yep.
Right? Well, what happened? Not only did Ohio State win, they destroyed them. Right? So, I mean, no, every team is different. Right? This is a different Notre Dame team than last year. In some areas, it's better. In some areas, it's worse. This is a different Georgia team. And let's not forget, you want to talk about past performance is the best indicator of future success. Okay, cool. What happened the last two times Notre Dame played Georgia?
Very close.
Because they're not playing Clemson or Alabama.
Yep.
They're playing Georgia.
Yep.
Well, Georgia has not. Why? Because Notre Dame matches up better with Georgia than most of the teams that they've played this year, than all the teams they've played so far. And so they lost by 6 and had the ball in their hands with a chance to win in the fourth. The last 2 times Notre Dame played Georgia, they had the ball in their hands in the last 5 minutes of the game, or last 3 minutes of the game with a chance to win. So if past performance equals future success, then I repeat again, why do people think Notre Dame is going to get boat raced by Georgia? Well, this is a better Georgia team. The first Georgia team that Notre Dame lost to by 1 point was the national runner-up. They lost in overtime to Alabama. It's not like that was a 4-loss Georgia team. So, I don't kind of understand that.
And let's go with that because that works for both teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't it work for both teams? Because their head coach in past big games has shown the propensity to coach uptight.
That's right.
And close to the vest when he has the better team. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that. Right?
I think the best coaching game he ever did was against Oklahoma in 2017 because I don't think he had the better he felt he had the better team. Yes. He felt they had to do things differently to beat Oklahoma. But you look at the way he coached that game and the way he coached against Alabama in the next game, totally different.
Totally different.
Totally
and
different.
What about Ohio State? Ohio State also had a history of losing big games, losing bowl games.
Their most recent title game, they got destroyed by Alabama.
Destroyed.
They've lost 31-0. Yeah.
What happened when they lost their quarterback? They barely got in, and they upset number 1 Alabama, and then went on to beat the Heisman Trophy winner and number 2 Oregon for the national championship. So it doesn't matter. You get in, you take your chances.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah, Ohio State's 1-3 the last 3 times they've made the playoff. 1-3.
But
I mean, so we have to look at what these teams for what they are now.
They have that one.
Right.
They have that one.
And nobody thought they had a chance that year.
No.
Because you had Florida State came on. They were the defending champs. They were undefeated. They had this high explosive offense. Oregon had the Heisman Trophy winner, Marcus Mariota. And then, of course, Bama's Bama. Right. 2-time, won 2 of the last 3 national titles. Right. And Ohio State's the team that came out on top. I want to respond to Melvin's question. It says, no. Just getting in is not going to be beneficial for the overall program, especially if Matt's up against Georgia. Front 7 will be all over cement, shoes, cone. That's exactly why Notre Dame needs to play Georgia. Because if you are correct, then Notre Dame needs to know that's where the program is lacking. Mm-hmm. And Brian Kelly can say, we have to make changes to get to that. That's good for the program. Right? When Clemson kept losing in those big games, they say, well, I wish they wouldn't have gone to that Orange Bowl and got boat raced by West Virginia. I wish they would have played in the Insight.com Bowl. Maybe they could have won that one. No, getting exposed by West Virginia is what caused him to make changes on his defensive staff to bring in this guy named Brent Venables.
Right.
Right? You need those losses. When Ohio State went into the playoff in 2016 and got absolutely blasted by Clemson, people forget what Ohio State did with that football team. And you remember what he did with that football team? His offensive coordinators that year were Tim Beck and Ed Warner.
Yes.
You know what he did? He did that in the offseason? He went out and hired Ryan Day. Had you not gotten boat raced by Clemson, then your program's not exposed for where you are.
Yes.
Notre Dame going and beating Pitt is going to, if they beat Pitt, is going to tell Brian Kelly you're on the right path.
Yes.
If you go play Georgia and you hang with them or beat them, it's going to tell Brian Kelly you're on the right path. If you go play Georgia and you get embarrassed, then that's going to tell Brian Kelly you're not on the right path. In these areas, you've got to make changes. So, yes, it is good for the program to get into that kind of game and get beat if you think that's what's going to happen. But I don't. Could it happen? Of course. Almost every playoff game that's been there's been a blowout. I mean, that's the thing is Notre Dame's not unique. No. Most games are blowouts. Urban Meyer got beat 31-0 one year in the playoff, right? Nick Saban has a title game loss by 28 points. Dabo's caught 2 beatdowns in the postseason. 3, really, if you want to count 2017, because even though the game was like 24-6, it was not a close game.
No.
So again, Melvin, that's the only way you can truly evaluate where you are and make the necessary changes to get there, is if you are on that stage against the best of the best. And beating Michigan does not tell you, are you closer to beating Bama or Georgia or Ohio State than you were coming into the season?
And there's nothing beneficial about beating a tier 3 team
Mm-mm.
in a bowl game for Notre Dame.
Because
Like,
Brian Kelly's proven he's going to do that. He's always, I mean, that's the thing. And that's something you give him a lot of credit for. If you have a less talented roster than Brian Kelly, you have literally since 2017, zero chance.
they're going to beat you.
Since 2018, they're going to beat you. And I love this by D-Rock. This is perfect. To be the best, you need to compete against the best.
This is something that goes to maybe he isn't getting the message, right? Maybe he's not.
Who? You talking about Coach Kelly?
Yeah, maybe he's not.
Well,
based upon what you just said, the 2 times that he lost in the college football playoff, he got beat by first-round picks at one position.
Right, and he made excuses for that. Right.
Yes.
This right here, Melvin, is again, Melvin, we're not pushing back on you. I love the fact that you're coming in here and pushing back on our narrative. That's great, man. That's why you're getting moved to the front of the line, because we love that. But he says we can look at this team now and know that we are not there yet. But Brian Kelly hasn't shown the ability to do that. Look, I got the stuff people are complaining about now. You're negative. You know, look at what they're doing. It's the same thing people got mad at me for in 2015 when I said there's something wrong with this program that the talent is masking. Well, no, they almost beat Clemson and they almost beat Stanford and they almost, they played Ohio State. It was 28-21 in the third quarter, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You lost to 3 top 5 teams, right? Okay, cool. But there were problems in that program that your talent was able to overcome because he looked at this team and said, gee, we're almost there. And he ignored the fact that Brian Van Gorder was a problem. He ignored the fact that Paul Longo was a problem because of the results. We were 10-3. We lost close games to 3 top 5 teams. You need games like last year against Alabama, because you know what last year Alabama equaled? Alabama beating Notre Dame in the Rose Bowl last year equals Brian Kelly doing whatever it takes to get Marcus Freeman here.
Yes.
Do you think if Notre Dame goes out and plays a close game against Alabama that he's like, you know what?
Yes.
No, that equaled Marcus Freeman. That equaled Brian Kelly going out this offseason and recruiting like he's never recruited before at Notre Dame.
And what
took that beat down to do that.
What did that equal defensively? What did Marcus Freeman immediately come in and do?
Recruiting
sent out offers that Notre Dame would not have offered.
Literally half the defensive class right now either didn't have an offer when he arrived or Notre Dame was not going to get him. Actually more. I don't think Benjamin Morrison had an offer. Devin Moore didn't have an offer. Jaden Mickey didn't have an offer. Jalen Sneed didn't have an offer. Junior Tuilamaka didn't have an offer. Tyson Ford had an offer, but they weren't in it for him.
Right.
They were like second or third behind Oklahoma and some other teams. They were not going to get Aiden Cabrera. He was probably going to go to Penn State. It wasn't until Marcus Freeman showed up along with Mike Mickens and Mike Elston. And again, that all ties back to the loss to Bama.
They lost to Alabama because they could handle or they could compete up front. But when Alabama got their athletes in space against Notre Dame's defensive backs and their linebackers, that's where they took advantage of Notre Dame. It wasn't like they just beat Notre Dame down like they did in 2012.
Right.
They looked at the film and they said, yo, you know what they said? We're not going to challenge number 14. They tried it once, almost threw an interception, and that was it for the rest of the game. And they said, we're going to go to the quick passes, get our athletes in space because they're better than their athletes, and that's how we'll beat Notre Dame. And Notre Dame now is recruiting long, lengthy athletes at linebacker and in defensive backfield. That's why guys like Xavier and Wonka are very important to this class. You get him, you get the depth. You see what we saw from our youngsters in the secondary. Xavier Watts against Navy and against Virginia. You see what we saw from our guy Ramon Henderson. And you see, yes, now we're getting more athletic on the back end. And that bodes well for next year and the year after that. And this team better be ready for next year if you look at that schedule. They better be ready.
And that's exactly why you need to see how you stack up against Georgia and Ohio State and Oregon this year. Because if you go out and beat Wake Forest or Pitt or Michigan, do you really know how far away you are from Ohio State when in Clemson and when you got to play them next year?
Yeah.
That's the whole point. And so I understand where Melvin's coming from because he's looking at it from like you go 12-1 and you win a big bowl game. That's more of a fan thing than it is how, like, as a coach, you want to know if look at boxing, right? Deontay Wilder just destroying people.
Right.
Until he went against Tyson Fury and he realized, I don't know how to box yet. Right.
Right.
Had he not fought a guy like Tyson Fury, then he never would have known that, hey, I got a powerful right hand, but I don't know how to box, not like a champion.
Right.
Right. And so now he's constantly trying to figure out, how do I beat that guy?
Right.
Going out and beating people who you just way better than. It's the same way in any sport, individual sport, team sport. If you want to know really truly how you stack up against the best, you have to get on the field of play against the best. And then you can evaluate where you are. And that's what Notre Dame, that's the opportunity that Notre Dame has. And that's what I want to have Notre Dame have.
You've coached, you've taught the kids, you've recruited. Is it easier to walk in and say, look, we've been to the college football playoffs 3 of the last 4 seasons. It might not have gone well, but we're right there. Or, you know what? We've been 2 out of 4. We didn't make it last year. We lost to Cincinnati, and that's what kept us out. Like, what would you really want to tell a recruit and sell a recruit? So, yeah.
I want to recruit. We're on the verge. You're the difference.
We're on the verge, and you're the difference.
I want to respond to this. Wendell says, this team is a dominant defensive line away from being on the same level as Bama and Georgia. If this team had Tuitt and Lynch, they'd be number 1. Strongly disagree with that. Notre Dame's defensive line has been the best part of this football team. And with all due respect, Notre Dame's had several dominant defensive lines in recent seasons.
Is he talking about as far as the program, or is he talking about just this year, Brian?
I think right now he's talking about this year. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. But like, to me, that's the best part of your team. That's not the reason that you lost to Cincinnati. You held Cincinnati almost 20 points below their season average. The defensive line is the reason it was even a game. It was, what, 13-0 or what was the score? And then all of a sudden the defensive line goes out and makes a sack. Right. Ahrensberger jumps up, forces Ritter to pump it. Foskey strips it. Defensive line made that play. The only reason you're 9-1 right now is because your defensive line has been really darn good this year.
Yep.
So, I mean, no, it's not as good as Georgia's, but neither is anybody else's. The reason Notre Dame is not number 1 right now is because their offense is not where it needs to be. Even still, it's not there. The offensive line was atrocious beginning of the season. Look, if the offense would have played against Cincinnati like it is now, and the defense was no better than it was that day, Notre Dame wins by 10 to 14 points. Right? And let's not forget, 24 points that Cincinnati scored, they started 2 possessions inside the 20-yard line.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the super chat, though, Wendell. I just don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, look, you could say that about a lot of people if they had Tuitt and Lynch. But Notre Dame wasn't a great defense when they had Aaron Lynch. They weren't a great defense till he left because there were other reasons why. But again, that defensive line had a great – I mean, that defensive line played well against Bama in 2012. It's because they weren't good enough in other positions is why they got smashed in that game. And this team would be no different. Maybe they'd only lost to Cincinnati 14-13 if they had Stephon Tuitt or Aaron Lynch. But they still would have lost because your offense didn't score. Let's not forget, one of Notre Dame's touchdowns on offense was basically because of the defense.
Defense turnover, defense turnover. And it's after, you know what? It really is that game for me. When you tell the story of this season, that Cincinnati game will be an aberration because it will say this is when Notre Dame realized, you know what we're doing in the direction we're trying to go is not working. We really have to change some things.
Right.
Which is kind of like a microcosm of what you're saying, Brian. You have to have those moments that are going to show you what needs to be changed.
Right.
So that you can improve and get better. They had that within the season against Cincinnati and going to the playoff in the big picture. Facing Georgia would do the same thing for the program, big picture.
Right. If Notre Dame beat Cincinnati, let's just say Notre Dame would have beat Cincinnati. Would Brian Kelly have made the bye-week changes that he made?
No.
We don't know the answer to that, but I don't think he would. And Melvin is still hammering that, buddy. And I love the fact that you're staying to your convictions. But how can he not know that already? If a high school coach in Minnesota can see it, I'm sure Kelly can.
You're asking us.
Yeah. Well, my thing is, I'm going to disagree with that a little bit because I've coached on some teams where we were just so much better than everybody around us that it was hard to actually see where we were lacking. Or, and again, a perfect example is the offensive line. The offensive line early in the season played some really good defenses and struggled. Now, all of a sudden, it's looking much better because they're playing really bad defenses. Now, is a combination of that plus they are getting better, or are they just getting way better and it doesn't matter who they play? I would contend that that the defenses that they've played has somewhat masked that the offensive line isn't as far along as you think. But Brian Kelly sees that and he's thinking, hey, my buddy Jeff Quinn's got this thing rolling, right? And I also think it's human nature to not look. It took Urban Meyer losing back-to-back games at the end of the 2013 season against Michigan State in the Big Ten title game, and they giving up 40 to Clemson. Then made him realize Everett Withers ain't getting the job done. He should have known that beforehand, right? It took Tim Beck and Ed Warner getting thoroughly outcoached by Clemson in the 2016 playoff for him to realize that was a bad move, right? Now, look, Nick Saban started to make evolution to his offensive philosophy, not after just Cam Newton, but after Cam Newton and Johnny Manziel in 2 out of 3 years kind of started doing what they did. And then Ole Miss went out with Bo Wallace and beat him back-to-back years. He's thinking, these mobile quarterbacks that are making these big plays are giving us problems. It forced him to say, we can't just play power football for the rest of our tenures. We have to be able to score because this is the evolution of college football. If he doesn't face Cam Newton, if he doesn't face Johnny Manziel, does he make those changes as quickly as he did? No, it's him seeing it up close and personal and what those guys did to his team that caused Nick Saban to say, we have to eventually start going in that direction. Now, he didn't try to copy them because their offense they don't have a dynamic quarterback athletically at quarterback. Bryce Young is not a dynamic athlete like Johnny Manziel or Cam Newton. He's a pocket passer.
Right.
He's athletic, but he's a pocket passer. Mac Jones was a pocket passer. Tua was a pocket passer. But it's more about you need to have a dynamic offense. That's the key. It doesn't mean go mimic what Auburn did or what Texas A&M did because you can't guarantee that you're going to have a Cam Newton or a Johnny Manziel.
No.
But it's the notion of having explosive, high-octane offenses that you have to have, and that caused them to change. But it took a loss to cause that to change. I said this offseason that Clemson was gonna struggle because I've seen chinks in the armor, and Dabo did nothing about it because they kept winning. And you say, well, they got embarrassed by Ohio State last year, but they didn't have Tony Elliott in that game. Because remember, Tony Elliott tested positive for COVID, so he didn't coach in that game.
Right.
So Dabo didn't really have that come to Jesus moment that he's having right now, that my offensive line coach isn't getting it done, which, Sean, we talked about this summer. Right. And you know what I mean? So sometimes because they're so much better than everybody they've played.
The first time he should have saw those flaws was the championship loss to LSU.
Yes.
Especially with his wide receivers.
Yeah.
And the way they struggled to get off bump and run.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, Stingley at that point, he was just a freshman, and he's about to go to the NFL draft like in the top 5.
And the same thing happened to them in the semifinal game against Ohio State, too, Sean.
Ohio State.
And I would actually argue that Ohio State's defense did even better against Clemson than LSU's. The difference is Clemson couldn't keep up with LSU's offense.
Right.
I mean, the semifinal game over Ohio State was Trevor just said, okay, boys, jump on my back. I got you. Right. But it took him really getting embarrassed by teams that he wasn't superior to without built-in excuses like not having your OC to make him realize, we got to make some changes. And I think he's going to make changes this offseason. But would he have done so if Clemson was undefeated and let's say they would have beat Georgia, a fluky game, let's say they would have or lost to Georgia, but still gone and beat NC State, right? Still gone and beat who's the other team that beat Clemson this year? Why am I drawing a blank on this?
NC State beat
them. Lost to NC State and they lost to Georgia.
And Pitt beat them.
Pitt beat them by 10.
Mm-hmm.
If they beat those teams by a field goal, does Dabo have the same? No. Right. So again, this isn't a knock on Brian Kelly. This is just the nature of a coach. I've been on teams where it's like, boy, I thought we were pretty good. Like I remember my first year coaching, we were 11-1. We were ranked we were a top 5 team in the country. The first 2 rounds of the playoff, we went down to Texas and won an overtime game against a really good Texas team who had a receiver that ended up going to the NFL. The next round of the playoff, we played the 2 seed and we beat them 41-0 at their place. We were feeling really good about ourselves. We beat Wabash that year, who had Chris Creighton as their head coach, who's now the head coach at Eastern Michigan. And we were getting ready for Mountain Union saying, hey, fellas, we're going to have to play a good game, but we got a shot. We can beat these guys. Man, they beat our guys played as well as they could have, and they beat us 49-21. And it was just like, it didn't matter what we did. But it wasn't until we actually got on the field with them that we realized, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we're not there yet. And funny story about that. Do you know who one of the starting defensive end was for that Mountain Union team? One of their starting defensive ends' name was Matt Campbell.
Wow.
Yeah.
Going back to that 2012, you remember this. It was, I believe Urban Meyer was out of football, working for.
In 11. In 11 he was.
But he was standing on the sideline, working for ESPN, thinking about getting back into coaching. And he sat there and said, I watched Alabama tonight, and now I know where my program has to get to.
Right.
It was his ability to see it up close and personal that let him know, okay, now I know how I need to build my program. I can't build it like I did at Florida. I can't build it like I did in Utah.
Right.
This is where the game has progressed to, and this is where we have to go. He takes the job at Ohio State. 3 years later, who does he beat to get to the national championship game? He beats Alabama because he laid the foundation, and it took 3 years. If it takes losing to Georgia and it takes another 2 years to get to the national championship, do you care if it happens in 2024? I don't. Ultimately, I want the trophy to be hoisted by Brian Kelly and Notre Dame. That's it.
Right. Yep. That's where I'm at, Sean. This has been a fun discussion, Sean. I really appreciate you coming on. We had something from Caleb Collins. I missed a super chat of his, but hey, Caleb, here's the cool thing. We can now go back because StreamYard has finally fixed this problem. I'm so excited about this. I can now scroll back and find the super chat of yours that we missed. But basically, what he was doing, Sean, and I did see it earlier, and I just forgot to get to it. He was talking about what he felt the committee wanted. And how he felt the committee wanted to get that. By the way, Melvin, appreciate that. By the way, man, I really enjoy the discussion. I do. I always respect people that are willing to push back because that's what makes fun. That's what's fun of talking about sports. If we're just always agreeing all the time, it's not going to be as much fun. So I appreciate that. I'm trying to find this super chat. We had a lot of comments tonight. That is awesome. Okay, here it is. Thank you for this, Caleb. He said what they want: number 1, Ohio State; number 2, Bama; number 3, Notre Dame; number 4, Georgia. I don't know if that's necessarily the order they want it, but yeah, I think that's the 4 they want. Yeah.
You know what? My only pushback on that, I mean, of course, perfectly, yes. They probably want that every year.
Right.
Perfect. And they can just switch it around based upon how the season goes. From a money standpoint, yes.
This is ESPN if that's every year. If that's the Final Four, this is ESPN, right?
But for this year, specifically for this year, I would probably say I would swap out Bama with Oregon because if Bama's in there, that means that there's some chaos going on because that means Bama's upset Georgia.
Yeah.
And now Notre Dame doesn't really have a chance to get in unless they just jump Notre Dame over Cincinnati.
Well, I think that what he's hoping for is that Cincinnati loses and Oregon loses. And honestly, if those two things happen, Notre Dame's in the playoff.
Yeah. Okay, you know what,
Caleb? I mean, again, assuming Ohio State, because if Ohio State's in,
right,
that means they beat Michigan State and Michigan. They're out, right? So now Notre Dame moves up 2 spots. Right?
His point is correct.
Right.
Like, that's what they want all the time.
I would say in that case, Caleb, if Bama beats Georgia, they should be and will be number 1. And so you'd have Bama number 1. You'd have Notre Dame.
Well, based upon the precedent, though.
What precedent?
Georgia, even though Georgia would have lost the head-to-head, Georgia's been the more dominant team.
No, but here's the reason I say that, because I feel like they would jump because Georgia has a lot of good wins, but who's the ranked team that Georgia's beat this year?
At the time?
No, now.
Right now.
That's how the committee looks at it, right? The committee looks at where you are now. The answer is they haven't beat one.
Okay, you're right. But then that goes to our point of you play who you have to play, and if you dump.
But when you talk about seeding, right? So again, Georgia's in, but when you talk about seeding,
and I can't. What type of win it is, right?
I can't justify putting a Georgia team that at that point in time's best win would be over. Let me see what Georgia's best win would be. Their best win would be over Arkansas, who, if Bama is in, Arkansas would have at least 4 losses, right? So it would be what, 8-4 Arkansas?
Arkansas plays Bama this
Seven,
weekend,
right? Because they're 7-3 right now. They play
Right.
Missouri last game. So if Bama's in, that means they beat Arkansas. So Arkansas is 8-4.
Right.
It'd either be that or 7-5 Auburn. Would it be Kentucky, who's 7-3, and maybe they go 9-3, 8-4? Like you see what I'm saying? Like there's no good wins there.
Yeah.
And whereas Bama would have a win over Ole Miss, convincing win, and they'd have a win over Georgia. So to me, that's why Bama's got to have the higher resume or higher seed because they've had the better overall resume.
And it would be recency. Right? Yeah.
Right. And it's not about recent. I mean, even if you just say, let's say Bama would have played Georgia on the first game of the year, beat them, and then the same resumes are true and they don't have an SEC title game. Let's just say you take the title game aspect out of it. I still say Bama has a better overall resume. The only thing Georgia could argue is, well, we had a better loss. But that's not Bama would have at least 2 wins over top 25 teams. Georgia would have none.
That's fair.
Right. So I think it'd be, in that scenario, it'd be Bama 1, Ohio State 2, Georgia 3, Notre Dame 4. I don't see Notre Dame leaping Georgia if Georgia's only losses to Bama.
So are you saying that based upon, is that regardless of any type of loss? Like if Bama kicks a game-winning field goal to win by 1.
Yeah.
And the SEC championship.
Yeah. Their resume still is much better than Georgia's.
Okay.
But again, you'd have a top 5 win, a top 15 win over Georgia and Ole Miss. What's the next best win that Georgia would have? Let's say Kentucky wins out, goes 9-3. Kentucky will jump into the top 25. That'd be it.
But see, that's for me. That I get that, and I actually agree with you.
Well, what would Bama's record be right now, and what would Bama look like if they had Georgia's schedule?
They probably will have 1 less loss.
Right, they'd be undefeated.
But this is my point. If Georgia played Bama's schedule, they would still be undefeated.
I don't necessarily agree. I just don't. I'm just not as in love with Georgia as a lot of people are.
Look, I can tell you
I would love to see Georgia and Ole Miss play each other. I really would. And here's why I say, because Georgia's got a great defense. Texas A&M's got a pretty darn good defense too, and Ole Miss just scored 29 on them. You don't got to score against Georgia. You don't got to score 40 points to beat them. And again, I think with Bama, we kind of know who they are because they've been tested. Again, I look back at Georgia and I say, who's really tested them that makes us know that they would definitely beat A&M and Ole Miss and Mississippi State, right? And that's the whole thing with Georgia's. It's about having to play those teams week after week after week. Bama's being tested that way. Georgia's not. And it's not their fault. It's not their fault Clemson wasn't a normal Clemson. I mean, one team that I've always respected in the SEC is Georgia. They played Boise State. Remember that? Back when Boise was legit. They've played Virginia Tech when Virginia Tech was really good. They've played Clemson in home and homes. They played Notre Dame in a home and home. They're back with Clemson again, right? Like, I respect Georgia. It's not their fault. They're an SEC team that plays 2 Power 5s out of conference every year.
Right.
Love that. I respect that. It's not their fault that Clemson's down and Georgia Tech's down. But it is the reality of looking at the resume. And I can't justify having them over Alabama with equal records if their best win is over Kentucky, no matter how that game unfolds, because you still have to look at the resume. So let's just say you take the Alabama-Georgia game as a wash and say, boy, they were pretty equal, right? It just basically is whoever had the ball last. Bama had the ball last, they won. It was 2 great teams. Then you got to look at the rest of the resume. The rest of the resume is Alabama has a convincing 21-point win over an Ole Miss team that's going to finish in borderline top 10, if not in the top 10. And Georgia's best win is going to end up being over a team that currently is not even ranked. And that's Kentucky. And that's assuming Kentucky beats Louisville at Louisville, which isn't a given. Then after that, it's like, okay, you beat Tennessee, who's got 4 losses. You beat Auburn, who's got 4 losses, including 1 to Penn State, who's not very good.
Yeah.
Again, I just think the overall resume for Georgia is just not there.
Okay, this is my only thing, because you said you would like to see Ole Miss. Georgia would kill Ole Miss. Okay, and let me tell you why. I saw Tennessee play Ole Miss. I saw Arkansas.
Keep in mind, Tennessee didn't have their 3 top receivers from the Ole Miss game against Georgia.
Yes, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
But I also watched Arkansas walk into Ole Miss and basically go for 2.
Mm-hmm.
Look, there are certain teams.
But those teams all have – I mean, those teams have pretty good offenses. Georgia doesn't have that great of an offense.
Look, but once again, the dynamic – LSU had a great offense. They didn't have a great defense.
Mm-hmm.
There are just certain teams that are special in that year.
Sure.
The Georgia Bulldogs are one of those.
They could be.
Teams.
They could be. But
it's up to them to prove
but
it.
If the premise of this conversation is they lose to Bama, right?
Yeah.
That's the premise of the conversation.
Well, I was just saying if they had Alabama's schedule.
But you're arguing what you think they would do. I don't know. I don't agree with you, right? So the point is because they didn't play Ole Miss, we can't know for certain.
Right.
I have my prejudice towards Georgia negatively. You have your prejudice towards Georgia positively based on what we've seen, right? And I mean that like not in a negative either way. It's just negative. We come to our own conclusions based on things that haven't played out. We don't know who would win.
Right.
So my point would be, based off what we do know is Bama was at one play better than Georgia on a neutral field. And that's the thing too, is the neutral field thing matters too. Okay, so you'll take that out. What we do know is that Bama could go and play top 20 teams and beat them. Right? They had to play multiple top 25 teams, and they won all but one of them, and including a top 5 win over Georgia, and what will end up being potentially a top 10 win over Ole Miss.
Right.
Because Ole Miss was what, 12th? Right? Ole Miss was 12th. And let's see who Ole Miss has left. I know they have Mississippi State. They play Vanderbilt this weekend and at Mississippi State. I got to think Ole Miss is going to be 10-2. If they're 10-2, they're in the top 10, right? So now Bama would have 2 top 10 wins, maybe a top 10, maybe top 25 over Arkansas. We'll see how they pan out. We'll see if Mississippi State pans out. I think if Mississippi State loses to Ole Miss, they're out. If Arkansas loses to Bama, they may be out. One of those 8-4 teams is going to be in, right?
Yep.
So then you say, okay, what is Georgia's best win? Again, if we're looking at resume of because again, it's based on what they've done. I just look at Georgia's resume and say, you could very well be right, Sean. But if we're talking about who should be ranked higher, Bama or Georgia, I think you have to put them, which is why I also said I'd still have Georgia ahead of Notre Dame, because they have been so much more convincing in their wins than Notre Dame, even though you could argue Notre Dame has a better win than Georgia does. But if you look at that resume top to bottom, Georgia's, like you said, Georgia's dominated everybody they've played so far. They haven't, other than the Clemson game, they haven't played a competitive game all season.
No.
Notre Dame's beaten Toledo by 3 and Virginia Tech by 3. Georgia would be ahead of that. That's why I said Georgia would fall to 3. Because I think at that point in time, they would jump Ohio State over them. But that's, 2 and 3 there, doesn't matter. The fact is 2 and 3 would be Ohio State and Georgia in some order. And then Notre Dame would be 4.
Yeah.
You have Georgia against Ohio State, and that the game would tell us a lot about Georgia.
I think you're absolutely right. And actually sitting back and listening to you, I think you're right. And I think the committee will look at it that way. I think I'm speaking from it just in the form of what I think is about to happen. Mm-hmm. Right? And I could be wrong. Mm-hmm. But I'm identifying early, based upon what I've seen with other special teams, that you know what? This is a special team. Yeah. And I'm just identifying that. I'm going to be honest. I don't think Bama's going to beat them. I just really don't.
No, I don't disagree with that. I'm not in love with Bama this year. I mean, Bama's been vulnerable. They almost lost to LSU. They almost lost to Florida. They got beat by Texas A&M. I don't think Texas A&M's that good. They got 41 points with an A&M team that I don't think is that good on offense. Now, A&M's got a really good defense, in my opinion. Elko's done a great job building that defense, but their offense is mediocre, in my opinion. So my point would be, you could be correct. But we were just working off of Caleb's premise of
rankings. Yep.
Yeah, yep. Of Caleb's of Bama wins.
And you're right on point. You're right on point the way you broke it down.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So again, that's just, it's about how the committee's going to view it. You and I could say, hey, look, it's like, let's just say there was no SEC title game this year, and Bama went undefeated and Georgia went undefeated. We would then have to make a judgment call based on, okay, I think this team is better.
Right.
Based on the eye test, but statistically, this team has 4 wins over ranked top 25 teams, and this team has none. Right. It's kind of like not as bad, but kind of like the argument we've had about Clemson in the past.
Yeah.
It's like, well, is Clemson really that good, or is it the schedule? And unfortunately for Georgia, the SEC East has been pretty down this year. and Clemson was down this year,
Yeah.
and Georgia Tech's down this year. So you and I may think Georgia's really good. You think they're better than I think they are. But the whole point is we don't know. If Florida was a normal Florida and Tennessee was a normal Tennessee, then for me, and Georgia beat them the way that they beat them, I'm with you because they'd have like 3 top 25 wins, right? But part of it too is I really want to see Alabama against Arkansas to really ultimately have that opinion, because to me that's the kind of the one game that those two teams have that is, a comparable good team, in my opinion. Because if you look at the two teams that they've both played, I think Tennessee has won. Alabama beat Tennessee 52-24. That game was more competitive than that.
Yeah.
Like, and to me, I look at Georgia and I say Georgia beat them 41-17 until Tennessee lost that Peyton kid at receiver. They were moving the ball on Georgia. He goes down and they don't move the ball again anymore. So it's like neither team was overly impressive to me against Tennessee compared to each other. Meaning, like, when I say overly impressive, I mean one wasn't more overly impressive than the other just comparing to each other. I'm not saying that they were both impressive. They both blew out Tennessee.
Yeah.
Compared to each other, I think it's kind of a wash. Georgia destroyed Arkansas. What does Bama do to Arkansas? If Bama struggles at home against Arkansas, it wins, but wins by 10, 17. And I say, okay, yeah, we've got at least enough comparable opponents, Sean, that we can have an idea of how they should stack up.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I just feel like Alabama has just been more – they've been tested so much more.
Yeah.
And that even if you look at teams that were ranked at one point in time, Bama would have 1, 2, 3, 4 – wait a minute, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wins over teams that were ranked in the top 25 at one point in time. Georgia would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, so even then it's one less.
Yeah.
So I just need to see that, and then but at the end of the day, it's all going to get settled at the end.
Yep.
Anyway, so we do have one last super chat that I want to get to before we head out of here, and this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate everybody being in here tonight. This was a ton of fun. Polaris 6, my man, thank you so much for that super chat. I really appreciate it. It says, I miss on Sean's intro and how you know Brian. I really hope you are part of the lineup in the future, as I love your takes. Just got my IB hat in the mail, and my 12-year-old son swiped it. Good kid. We listen in the car all the time. So, Sean, Polaris, thank you so much for that. So, first of all, Sean, let him know how he can listen to you every day, even when you're not a part of the Irish Breakdown podcast, which Sean's always going to be part of our team. It's just he has his own thing going on too that he is building up, which we want you to know about now. So tell him about your podcast. And by the way, you'll be with us tomorrow, right?
Yeah,
second half of our.
Both of us will be with you tomorrow. Oh.
Well, now it's out there. Malik's going to join the show tomorrow during our fundraiser. So sorry, it's out there now.
I'm sorry about that.
It's all good. Let him know. I didn't tell you.
Our podcast is the Lucky Lefty Podcast. You can go subscribe to it, Lucky Lefty Podcast, our YouTube channel. And it's myself and former Notre Dame quarterback Malik Zaire is my co-host. And we spin it different, and we talk about Notre Dame football and all type of pop culture topics just to make you laugh and just have fun with it. And so you can find me there. You can go look at all the content we've put up this week. And then I'm usually here with these guys on Irish Breakdown. Whenever I'm needed, I will jump in, and it's always great because literally, like, this show is literally the same 2-hour conversation we would have on the phone. I think you're muted again.
We have had those conversations this week.
Yes. So when you see me, myself and Brian, or myself and Vince, I don't talk to Vince as much, but it's really just organic conversation that we would have over the phone via text.
The problem is sometimes it's like, wait a minute, did we already say that in the show? Or is that something Sean talked about earlier today?
Right. Absolutely.
Like, Sean, we're doing a show tonight. Don't call me until the show's over because I want to make sure it's fresh ideas. So, so Lucky Lefty Podcast. Okay, so definitely check that out. And as Sean said, they will talk football, which we do as well, but they also kind of go in some fun, different directions, which is a lot of fun. Definitely check that out. And Sean will be with us tomorrow during the second half of our fundraiser podcast. And so we've got a couple new partners that we've worked with today. So we're now up to 5, maybe 6. Waiting on one more person to call me back tomorrow, maybe 6 partners as far as what we're doing tomorrow, which for those of you that don't know, tomorrow's show, which begins at 12:30 Eastern, is going to be a normal mailbag. We're going to have Vince is going to be part of the show for an hour. Sean is going to join us in the second hour. Malik Zaire is going to join us. We've got a couple other former Notre Dame players right now lined up to go. A friend of mine that covers Notre Dame in the local area is also going to be part of the show for a little bit tomorrow. We'll have John Garcia on there tomorrow to cover some recruiting. And the whole point is we are going to ask you for super chats. We are also creating a donation page. I hope my wife has got that done by now. But a donation page, and all the money that we raise, every single penny that you give to us, that Google gives us our cut, and the money that you donate, all of it is going to go towards going out and buying food and supplies and things for people in need in our community. So we really want to try to give back. We've been blessed. Sean and I both have been blessed with tremendous opportunities and tremendous platforms. And we want to be able to help out people who haven't been as blessed in this particular area as us. And so that's what tomorrow's show will be. So we're going to talk football all day, but it's the money you give us to ask the questions and be part of the mailbag is something that we're going to give to the local community. So spread the word, tell people to come join the show. If you're able to and willing to give, we would greatly appreciate that. So anyway, so hey, Sean, buddy, thank you so much for joining me tonight. This was a lot of fun.
It's my pleasure.
I look forward to you being back on.
Everybody, Irish Breakdown, IB Nation, NB Nation, man. Love you guys. Love the conversations. Love the back and forth. Let's go get these last 2 wins and get into this thing, man. Give ourselves a chance. So for Sean Davis, I'm Brian Driscoll. Everybody have a great rest of your night, and we will see you tomorrow. Yep. Give us a like, hit the share, give us a share, like, subscribe, notification, all that stuff. Have a great night, everybody. We'll talk to you tomorrow.